My son invited me onto his yacht by the shore to spend time together. But when I woke up, he was gone and I was locked inside during a deadly heat wave. So I thought, all right, if that is your plan. But I survived 36 years in the Navy and we do not die easy. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Garrison Cole, 69 years old and a retired chief engineer for the United States Navy. The midday Miami sun beat down at 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat radiated off the concrete pier in thick shimmering waves that distorted the horizon. The air felt heavy, dense with humidity, and the sharp metallic scent of salt water and diesel fuel. I stood at the edge of the dock, staring at the gleaming white hull of a newly purchased luxury yacht. The massive vessel bobbed gently in the calm harbor water, a monument to excessive wealth. My son Cameron stood on the aft deck waiting for me. He was 38 years old, dressed in pristine white linen pants and a light blue designer polo shirt. We had not spoken a single word to each other in 6 agonizing months. The total silence began the day I formally refused to hand over my life savings to fund his latest vague business venture. I had worked 3 decades in the military to secure my retirement. He had wanted to risk it all on a speculative tech startup. When I said no, he had called me a selfish, obsolete old man. He had slammed my front door and vanished from my life. Now, out of nowhere, he had invited me for a private father and son fishing trip. He claimed he wanted to patch things up permanently. He claimed he wanted to show me he had finally made it to the top on his own merit. I stepped onto the polished teakwood deck. Cameron approached quickly and wrapped his arms around me in a stiff, highly unnatural embrace. His muscles were entirely tense beneath his expensive shirt. He patted my back twice sharply, stepping away, as if physical contact with his own father caused him genuine physical pain. He forced a wide smile that failed completely to reach his eyes. His gaze kept shifting past my shoulder toward the open ocean. Up on the elevated flybridge, his wife Meredith looked down at us. She wore a wide-brimmed black sun hat and oversized designer sunglasses that hid half her face. A predatory smirk played on her lips. She did not bother to come down the stairs to greet me. She simply raised her crystal champagne flute in a silent, mocking toast. Meredith had always viewed me as a stubborn relic. She saw me as an annoying financial obstacle standing between her husband and the true wealth she felt entitled to. She despised my strict frugality. She hated my military discipline. Her looming presence here today on a supposed bonding trip, meant only for Cameron and me, sent an immediate blaring warning signal through my mind. I turned my attention away from her hostile glare and focused entirely on the vessel. My eyes swept over the pristine fiberglass lines and the massive outboard motors mounted heavily at the stern. Dual 12-cylinder engines, high-performance marine propulsion, insatiable fuel consumption. I spent 36 years stripping down massive steam turbines and rebuilding complex engine systems in the deep, pressurized bellies of military submarines. My brain automatically calculated the raw financial numbers required to keep this beast afloat. The monthly docking fees alone would cost thousands. The maritime insurance premiums would be astronomical. The raw fuel required just to idle out of the marina into the open water would drain a normal bank account in a matter of hours. Cameron worked as a mid-level sales manager for a regional logistics firm. His legitimate annual salary could barely cover the routine maintenance on a machine of this magnitude, let alone the massive upfront purchase price. The math simply did not align with reality. I looked him dead in the eye, searching for the crack in his confident facade. "Beautiful boat," I said, keeping my voice entirely neutral and flat. Cameron offered a tight, extremely nervous smile. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, pulling at the fabric as if he were suffocating. "Business has been incredible, Dad. I hit a series of massive commission bonuses this quarter. I wanted to share my new success with you. I want us to put the ugly past behind us completely." His voice lacked any real conviction. The pitch was entirely too high. He kept shifting his weight constantly from his left foot to his right foot. He was sweating heavily, and the intense Miami heat was only partially responsible for the moisture pouring down his neck. In the span of 5 minutes, I watched him check his heavy gold wristwatch 3 separate times. He was not looking at the time to ensure we caught the outgoing tide. He was rigidly tracking a predetermined schedule. I walked deliberately toward the stern, inspecting the heavy steel cleats and the reinforced rigging. "You bought this outright?" I asked, applying a slight amount of interrogative pressure. Cameron swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Yes. Paid in full. I told you I was making big moves, Dad. You just never believed in my vision. You always thought I would fail." Meredith called down abruptly from the upper deck, her voice dripping with artificial saccharine sweetness. "Stop interrogating him, Garrison. Today is about celebrating our family. Let the past go and just enjoy the sunshine." Her sudden intervention was highly deliberate. She was running tactical interference, protecting Cameron from my escalating scrutiny. I turned back to my son. He walked quickly over to a built-in refrigerated cooler, his movements rigid and robotic. He reached inside and pulled out a tall crystal glass filled with iced lemonade. Condensation dripped rapidly down the sides of the frozen glass. He handed it directly to me, pushing it into my chest. "Drink up, Dad," Cameron said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "It is brutally hot out here today. We need to stay completely hydrated before we head out to the deep water for the marlin." I took the glass from his trembling hand. The ice clinked sharply against the fine crystal. The Florida sun was indeed oppressive, draining the moisture straight from my aging skin. I looked at Cameron again. His eyes darted rapidly toward the empty dock, then back to my face, then straight up to the flybridge, where Meredith watched us like a hawk circling prey. Fear leaked aggressively from his every pore. I had spent decades reading the subtle body language of terrified young naval recruits facing high-pressure combat situations. Cameron exhibited every single symptom of a man executing a dangerous mission he barely had the stomach for. I assumed he was simply anxious about apologizing for his past disrespect. I assumed he was terrified about eventually breaking down and asking for another massive cash loan to cover the inevitable debts this floating palace would generate. I assumed wrong. I raised the heavy glass to my lips. The lemonade was intensely tart and heavily sweetened. The massive amount of sugar poorly masked a faint, bitter, metallic undertone. I took a long, deep swallow, eager to cool my parched throat. I drank half the glass before lowering it back to my side. Cameron let out a sharp, ragged exhale. The sound was pure relief. Up on the deck, Meredith finally lowered her champagne flute. Her smug smirk widened into a bright, terrifying grin of absolute pure satisfaction. The biological change happened within seconds. A heavy, aggressive chemical lethargy crashed violently into the base of my skull. The bright Miami sun suddenly fractured into blinding, painful shards of white light that pierced my retinas. The solid teakwood deck beneath my feet pitched violently, throwing me off balance, even though the water in the protected harbor remained completely dead calm. I tried to speak. I tried to demand an answer, to ask Cameron exactly what he had put in my drink. My tongue felt like a solid block of lead. My jaw completely refused to move. The glass slipped helplessly from my numb, tingling fingers. It shattered loudly on the pristine wooden deck. Ice cubes and yellow liquid scattered wildly around my leather shoes. I stumbled backward, losing all motor control over my lower body. My knees buckled instantly under my own weight. I collapsed heavily against the white leather seating of the aft lounge, my back striking the fiberglass bulkhead. My vision narrowed rapidly into a dark, suffocating tunnel. My breathing slowed to a crawl. Through the rapidly fading light, I saw my son standing perfectly still. He did not rush forward in a panic to catch my fall. He did not shout for medical help. He did not reach for his phone to dial emergency services. Cameron simply stared down at me with cold, dead eyes. He slowly raised his wrist and checked his heavy gold watch one final time. His absolute betrayal was the last thing my fading brain processed before the chemical darkness swallowed me whole. The transition from unconsciousness to waking was not a gradual lifting of fog. Senses returned to me with the sudden violent impact of a physical blow. The air inside the compartment possessed a tangible weight pressing against my chest like a damp wool blanket. I opened my eyes, but the absolute pitch blackness offered no visual relief. I lay flat on a hard diamond-tread steel floor. The aggressive metallic taste of the spiked lemonade coated the back of my throat with a bitter, chalky residue. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my muscles protesting with a heavy, unnatural sluggishness. The drug Cameron had used was powerful, designed to incapacitate quickly and thoroughly, but it was already burning out of my system. You do not survive 3 decades in the deep ocean by giving in to the immediate instinct to panic. I forced my breathing to slow down. I cataloged my assets. I was alive. I was conscious. I was trapped. I reached out in the darkness, letting my fingertips trace the riveted seams of the metal bulkhead. The steel was already radiating a dull, steady, and terrifying warmth. My tactical assessment of the space confirmed my location. This was the lower auxiliary equipment hold. It housed the backup generator, the secondary bilge pumps, and the raw water intake valves. It was a space designed exclusively for machines, not for men. It lacked natural light and featured only one point of entry. I crawled blindly across the vibrating floor deck until I found the primary hatch. It was constructed of solid marine-grade aluminum and reinforced with a heavy steel core. I ran my palms over the smooth surface until I located the interior latch mechanism. I gripped the heavy handle with both hands and pushed downward, applying my entire body weight to the lever. The handle refused to move even a fraction of an inch. I knelt and ran my fingers along the bottom edge of the doorframe. The primary locking pins were engaged firmly from the outside. Cameron had thrown the external deadbolt the moment he dragged my unconscious body down the stairs. I pressed my ear against the warm metal of the door and listened closely. In any sealed marine environment, the hum of the ventilation system serves as the heartbeat of the vessel. There was absolute silence. The intake blowers were dead. The exhaust fans were disabled. The ambient temperature in Miami was hovering at a brutal 105 degrees outside. Inside this unventilated steel box, surrounded by the thick fiberglass hull, absorbing the direct, unfiltered afternoon sun, the temperature was rising exponentially. The sheer, calculated malice of the murder plot washed over me with crystal clarity. Cameron did not possess the stomach for a violent, bloody confrontation. He was a coward who hid behind spreadsheets, tailored suits, and quarterly sales reports. Meredith was the true architect of this execution. She understood the intricate mechanics of plausible deniability. A brutal physical assault leaves forensic evidence. A gunshot requires a lengthy police explanation. Poison leaves toxicological traces in the bloodstream that a competent medical examiner will eventually uncover during a routine autopsy. But hyperthermia is a silent, invisible killer. They would leave me locked in this lightless oven while they took the motorized dinghy to shore. They would sit in an air-conditioned restaurant drinking expensive wine, eating expensive food, and establishing an ironclad documented alibi. Meanwhile, the temperature inside the hold would climb steadily past 120 degrees. My core body temperature would naturally follow. Profuse sweating would quickly lead to severe clinical dehydration. Tachycardia would set in as my heart struggled frantically to pump thickening blood to my vital organs. Confusion, delirium, and finally a massive cardiac arrest brought on by fatal heat stroke would end my life. When my body eventually shut down, the chemical traces of whatever heavy sedative Cameron had slipped into my drink would have fully metabolized and vanished from my system. Hours later, they would return to the yacht under the cover of darkness. They would unlock the heavy door, drag my lifeless body out onto the lower deck, and call the Coast Guard in a state of manufactured hysteria. The official story would practically write itself. An elderly man, allegedly suffering from early-stage dementia, wandered down into the mechanical hold. By accident, became disoriented in the dark, and tragically locked himself inside. The medical examiner would find zero evidence of foul play. The local authorities would issue a swift ruling of accidental death. Cameron would play the grieving, heartbroken son for the local news cameras. Meredith would offer a perfectly rehearsed performance of shock and sorrow. They would bury me quickly and move immediately to liquidate my entire estate to fund their lavish lifestyle. The air in the hold was becoming dangerously thin and aggressively hot. Every breath scorched the back of my throat. Sweat poured continuously from my forehead, stinging my eyes and soaking my linen shirt until it clung to my skin like a wet, heavy shroud. I could feel my pulse hammering rapidly against my ribs. The human body is a fragile engine, and mine was beginning to overheat at an alarming rate. In the summer of 1992, a massive electrical fire tore through the aft engine room of the USS Dallas, while we were submerged 300 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The ambient temperature in the sealed compartment reached 130 degrees before we managed to isolate the blaze. I spent 4 brutal hours in that suffocating hellscape, coordinating the damage control teams while breathing through a heavy chemical respirator. I learned a vital, unforgettable lesson that day about the direct relationship between fear and oxygen consumption. Panic accelerates the heart rate. A rapid heart rate demands significantly more oxygen. When oxygen is severely limited, panic becomes an absolute death sentence. I closed my eyes and forced my mind back to the disciplined rhythm of naval damage control. Breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold for 2 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Control the heart. Control the mind. I resumed my blind, methodical inspection of the compartment. My hands swept over the smooth casing of the backup generator. I felt the cold, hard edges of the wall-mounted wrench rack, but I found the tools completely missing. Cameron had systematically stripped the room of anything that could be used as a blunt instrument or a prying tool. He had prepared this steel coffin with meticulous, terrifying attention to detail. I found the secondary ventilation duct mounted near the ceiling. I reached up and pressed my bare hands against the heavy steel grating. It was bolted securely into the bulkhead with tamper-proof screws. Even if I managed to pry the rigid grating loose with my bare hands, the duct itself was barely 6 inches wide, making it completely impassable for a grown man. The air inside the duct was totally stagnant. Cameron had manually shut the external louvers on the top deck before coming down to greet me on the dock. The temperature spiked further. My lungs labored heavily to draw in the increasingly toxic stale air. I felt the first terrifying waves of dizziness wash over my brain. My legs trembled violently, threatening to give out completely and send me crashing to the steel deck. Dehydration was setting in rapidly, sapping the strength from my muscles. The absolute darkness pressed heavily against my eyes, playing tricks on my vision and creating phantom shapes in the blackness. I needed a breaching tool immediately. I needed something heavy enough to smash the locking mechanism of the primary hatch or rupture the thick fiberglass wall separating the hold from the main engine room. I moved along the portside bulkhead, dragging my open hands across the smooth surface. My knuckles struck a hard cylindrical object mounted securely in a quick-release bracket. I instantly recognized the shape: the emergency fire extinguisher. Maritime safety law legally required a heavy-duty carbon dioxide fire extinguisher to be securely mounted in every enclosed mechanical space on a commercial or private vessel. The outer casing was solid reinforced steel. It weighed roughly 20 pounds fully charged. It was the absolute perfect improvised battering ram. A sudden surge of adrenaline pushed the crippling fatigue out of my muscles. I reached out in the darkness and grabbed the thick metal neck of the extinguisher. I gripped the release latch and pulled upward with maximum force, ready to swing the heavy cylinder directly into the center of the reinforced door to shatter the locking pins. The extinguisher slid out of the bracket with horrifying, effortless ease. The momentum of my violent upward pull sent me stumbling backward because the cylinder possessed absolutely no weight. I fell hard against the metal decking, clutching the bright red cylinder to my chest. I quickly ran my thumb over the small glass pressure gauge mounted near the handle. The indicator needle rested dead flat at absolute 0. I pulled the metal safety pin out with my teeth and squeezed the trigger handle with all my remaining strength. A hollow, anemic hiss echoed pathetically in the pitch-black room. The canister was completely empty. Cameron had deliberately discharged the heavy carbon dioxide tank before I ever stepped foot on the yacht. The discarded red cylinder clanged uselessly against the diamond tread steel deck. The hollow metallic sound echoed in the pitch-black hold, serving as a brutal confirmation of my son's meticulous malice. Cameron had anticipated my every move. He had deliberately emptied the carbon dioxide canister before I ever stepped foot on the yacht, systematically removing brute force as a viable option for escape. I pushed myself up from the floor, my muscles heavy and uncoordinated. The chemical lethargy from the spiked lemonade still coursed through my veins, coating my tongue with a bitter synthetic residue. But the drug was no longer my primary enemy. The heat was. The ambient temperature inside the sealed auxiliary compartment was climbing aggressively past 120 degrees. The thick fiberglass hull of the yacht absorbed the brutal, unfiltered Miami sun, turning this windowless steel box into an industrial oven. Every breath I drew was a searing pull of stagnant, toxic air. Sweat poured from my forehead, stinging my eyes and soaking my linen shirt until it clung to my chest like a wet shroud. I knew exactly what was happening to my body. Severe clinical dehydration was setting in rapidly. My pulse hammered against my temples in a frantic, irregular rhythm as my heart struggled to pump thickening blood to my vital organs. The immediate primal instinct to hurl my fists against the reinforced door and scream for help roared in the back of my mind. I crushed that instinct instantly. Shouting is a rapid, useless waste of precious oxygen. Screaming accelerates the heart rate, and an accelerated heart rate invites panic. When oxygen is strictly limited, panic is an absolute death sentence. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind to detach completely from the suffocating reality of the yacht. The intense baking darkness instantly transported me back 2 decades. I was no longer a 69-year-old man facing execution by heatstroke on a luxury boat. I was a chief engineer standing in the lower engine compartment of the USS Dallas, submerged 300 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. A catastrophic electrical fire had turned our section into a literal furnace. The smoke had been thick and blinding. Junior sailors around me had lost their minds to fear thrashing blindly against the bulkheads as the temperature crested 130 degrees. I survived that day because I understood a fundamental law of physics and human endurance. You do not fight a machine with flesh and blood. You fight a machine by analyzing its vulnerabilities. Panic kills rapidly. Engineering saves. I opened my eyes, my vision adjusting slightly to the absolute absence of light. I focused entirely on the immediate mechanical environment. The heavy aluminum door was held shut by a commercial-grade magnetic lock. These marine locking mechanisms rely on a continuous, uninterrupted electrical current to maintain their high-tension magnetic seal. If the primary vessel power fails, they immediately switch to a localized battery backup concealed within the doorframe. I needed to severely disrupt that specific electrical circuit. I reached down to my waist and unbuckled my heavy-duty leather belt. I slid the thick strap through the loops and gripped the solid titanium buckle. The buckle was custom-forged, a retirement gift from my old naval unit. It featured a sharp, rigid flat edge designed for utility in the field. I crawled across the vibrating floor grates toward the emergency lighting panel, mounted adjacent to the reinforced door. The protective panel was secured by 4 heavy-duty tamper-proof screws. I wedged the flat edge of the titanium buckle directly into the groove of the first screw. My grip was incredibly slippery with profuse sweat. My forearm muscles trembled violently from the extreme heat and the lingering neurological effects of the sedative. I pressed my palm flat against the titanium buckle, utilizing my entire upper body weight to force the screw to turn. The metal groaned in sharp protest before finally yielding with a loud crack. I repeated this agonizing, excruciating process for the remaining 3 screws, actively ignoring the cramping pain shooting up my arms and across my shoulders. The heavy plastic cover dropped heavily to the steel floor. Inside the narrow wall cavity, a thick bundle of insulated wires fed raw power to the emergency light and the adjacent magnetic lock assembly. I needed exposed copper to bridge the connection. Without a blade to strip the thick industrial rubber casing, I had only one tool left at my disposal. I reached into the cavity and pulled the primary power wire tightly toward my face. I bit down hard on the heavy insulation. The bitter, toxic taste of burnt rubber and industrial adhesive flooded my mouth. I ground my back teeth deeply into the casing and yanked my head backward with a violent jerk. The tough rubber tore away, exposing a gleaming half-inch of raw copper wire. I repeated the brutal motion on the grounding wire, my jaw aching fiercely from the intense mechanical strain. Blood mixed with sweat on my chin. I spat the rubber fragments onto the deck. I now held two live exposed wires in my trembling hands. The magnetic locking mechanism was housed inside a thick polycarbonate shell directly above the door handle. I twisted the exposed copper strands together, forcing a direct and massive short circuit. A brilliant, blinding shower of blue and white sparks erupted violently in the pitch-black hold. The sudden intense flash temporarily blinded me. The extreme heat of the electrical arc instantly attacked the polycarbonate housing of the magnetic lock. Noxious white smoke hissed aggressively from the melting plastic. I maintained the connection, ignoring the sparks burning my forearms, letting the current continuously scorch the locking mechanism. The internal circuitry of the lock sizzled and popped loudly. I smelled the distinct acrid odor of frying circuit boards and melting wires. The localized battery backup failed violently under the severe electrical overload. A heavy, resounding metallic clack echoed through the small space. The magnetic seal had completely broken. I dropped the scorching wires to the deck. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy aluminum door, driving my shoulder into the metal with every ounce of momentum my exhausted body could generate. The weakened latch gave way instantly. The heavy door swung open, slamming against the outer corridor wall with a deafening crash. I stumbled out of the auxiliary hold, falling hard onto the polished mahogany floor of the lower deck hallway. I dragged myself up the curved wooden staircase toward the main deck, moving purely on lingering adrenaline and ingrained naval discipline. I pushed through the heavy glass sliding doors and collapsed onto the exterior aft lounge. The blinding Miami sun assaulted my vision, but the fresh, salty ocean breeze hitting my face was the sweetest sensation I had ever experienced. I lay flat on the white leather cushions, gasping deeply for air, forcing my burning lungs to expand and contract naturally. My vision slowly adjusted to the harsh, unforgiving glare. I pushed myself upright and grabbed the stainless steel railing to steady my dangerously trembling legs. I scanned the horizon, expecting to see the bustling Miami harbor or the familiar crowded coastline. Instead, I saw absolutely nothing but dense, impenetrable mangrove swamps bordering a stagnant, glassy expanse of dark green water. Cameron had not simply anchored the yacht offshore. He had navigated the vessel deep into an isolated, uncharted coastal cove, miles away from any standard maritime traffic lanes. The silence surrounding the yacht was absolute and terrifying. There was no low hum from the dual engines. There was no distant chatter from passing tourist boats or fishing vessels. The water was completely dead. I turned my attention to the stern, looking for the motorized dinghy we had towed from the marina. The heavy stainless steel davits hanging over the water were completely empty. The securing straps hung loose, swaying slightly in the faint, hot breeze. Cameron and Meredith had taken the only emergency lifeboat. They had systematically stripped the yacht of all communication equipment and abandoned the vessel in a total dead zone. I was entirely alone, trapped on a multi-million-dollar floating tomb surrounded by miles of uninhabited swamp, while my own son eagerly awaited the discovery of my rotting corpse. The oppressive heat radiating from the fiberglass deck offered no comfort, but the immediate threat of suffocation had passed. I stood alone on the stern of the deserted yacht, breathing in the thick, humid swamp air. My muscles ached from the violent exertion of escaping the auxiliary hold, but my mind operated with cold military clarity. Survival in hostile territory requires immediate situational awareness and rapid intelligence gathering. I needed to understand the exact parameters of the battlefield, my son had prepared for me. Cameron was a coward, but he was not a spontaneous killer. This execution was premeditated. The disabled ventilation, the emptied fire extinguisher, the isolated anchorage in an uncharted inlet. Every single detail pointed to a highly orchestrated operation. I needed the blueprint of his treason. I turned my back on the desolate mangrove shoreline and moved toward the main cabin. The heavy sliding glass doors were locked. I did not waste time looking for a hidden key. I wrapped my jacket tightly around my fist and drove my elbow directly into the center of the tempered glass pane. The structural integrity shattered instantly. I stepped through the cascade of falling glass into the main salon. The interior of the yacht was a monument to unearned luxury. White leather sofas, polished mahogany tables, and imported crystal decanters mocked the brutal reality of my current situation. The air conditioning was dead, leaving the cabin stifling and stagnant. I moved past the galley and headed straight down the narrow corridor toward the master stateroom. If Cameron had planned a murder on this vessel, he would keep the vital documentation close to his chest. He always possessed a fatal flaw of arrogance, believing his poorly constructed secrets were invisible to the world. I reached the master suite and kicked the door open. The room smelled overwhelmingly of Meredith's expensive floral perfume and Cameron's distinct cologne. The scent was a physical assault, a nauseating reminder of the two people who had just condemned me to a slow, agonizing death. I did not conduct a frantic emotional search. I executed a systematic tactical sweep. I emptied the mahogany dressers, tearing the custom-tailored clothing out onto the floor. I checked the linings of the expensive luggage stacked in the corner. I found nothing but the superficial trappings of their fake wealth. I turned my attention to the center of the room. The massive king-sized bed dominated the space. I grabbed the edge of the heavy mattress and heaved it off the frame with a violent surge of adrenaline. It crashed against the mirrored closet doors. I ripped away the wooden slats supporting the bed frame, exposing the bare fiberglass subfloor of the hull. My eyes scanned the flat surface. 36 years of inspecting naval architecture trained me to spot structural anomalies. Near the portside corner, a tiny, almost imperceptible seam broke the smooth fiberglass pattern. It was a flush-mounted access panel, entirely flush with the deck. I pulled the solid titanium buckle of my leather belt from my pocket. I wedged the sharp metal edge into the microscopic gap and applied maximum leverage. The panel popped open with a sharp crack, revealing a shallow, dark compartment. Inside lay a thick, heavy leather folio. I pulled it out. The leather felt cold and slick against my sweat-drenched palms. I carried the folio over to the small writing desk near the porthole to utilize the harsh afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass. I flipped the heavy cover open. The contents did not merely explain the murder plot. They detailed a spectacular, catastrophic financial collapse. The first stack of papers consisted of aggressive final notices. They were not standard bank foreclosures or polite credit card warnings. These were heavily coded, menacing letters from a notorious underground lending syndicate based out of Miami. I recognized the shell company names from my time working security logistics for the Port Authority. These were men who did not negotiate payment plans. They dealt in broken bones, seized assets, and sudden disappearances. The spreadsheets attached to the notices revealed the horrifying extent of Cameron's failure. He had borrowed heavily from loan sharks to maintain the illusion of a successful corporate executive. He had purchased the designer clothes, the luxury cars, and this multi-million-dollar yacht using lethal, unregulated debt. He was currently completely insolvent. The final deadline for a massive balloon payment of $800,000 was dated merely 3 days from today. I pushed the syndicate threats aside. Beneath them lay the true instrument of my execution. It was a pristine, legally binding contract from a premier global insurance conglomerate. I stared at the bold black lettering at the top of the first page. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy. The coverage amount was staggering: $5 million. The effective date of the policy was exactly 4 weeks ago. I flipped straight to the final page of the contract. My heart hammered a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. There on the bottom line designated for the primary insured was my signature. It was a flawless, masterful forgery. The loops and angles mimicked my handwriting with terrifying accuracy. Cameron had clearly traced it from the old financial aid documents I had signed decades ago to put him through college, or perhaps from the naval pension forms he had supposedly helped me organize last winter. He had weaponized my past trust to forge my death warrant. The beneficiary line was equally damning. It named Cameron Cole as the sole recipient of the $5 million payout, with Meredith Cole listed as the secondary beneficiary. The entire picture locked into perfect, horrifying focus. Cameron did not just want me dead because he hated me. He needed me dead to survive. My life was the exact currency required to pay off the syndicate enforcers breathing down his neck. The yacht was never a symbol of his success. It was the designated murder weapon. They had lured me into a meticulously designed trap, intending to trade my life for their financial salvation. A deep, consuming rage ignited in the center of my chest. It burned away the lingering effects of the sedative. It burned away the last 40 years of paternal obligation. I had sacrificed my youth in the crushing depths of the ocean to provide a stable, honorable life for a son who ultimately viewed me as nothing more than a disposable cash asset. I stared at the forged signature, feeling the raw, undeniable reality of his treason. He had condemned me to bake to death in a steel box so he could continue wearing tailored suits and drinking imported champagne. I carefully folded the insurance policy and the syndicate notices back into the leather folio. This was the blueprint of their destruction. I needed to secure it immediately. I looked around the room, searching for a waterproof container to protect the documents during my inevitable escape from the vessel. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the isolated cove shattered. A distant, high-pitched mechanical whine cut through the humid air. I froze, tilting my head toward the broken glass door of the salon. The sound grew rapidly in volume and intensity. It was the unmistakable roar of a high-speed outboard motor. It was echoing sharply across the flat, dark water of the mangrove swamp, heading directly toward the anchored yacht. My tactical assessment shifted instantly from investigation to immediate survival. Cameron and Meredith were not waiting for the cover of darkness to secure their alibi. The syndicate deadline was pushing them into a panicked, rushed timeline. They were returning right now to verify the kill and retrieve the corpse. I had less than 2 minutes before they boarded the vessel and discovered the shattered auxiliary hatch. They were coming back for a dead man, but the chief engineer was fully awake, heavily armed with the truth, and preparing to alter the fundamental rules of their deadly game. The distant, high-pitched mechanical whine rapidly transformed into an aggressive, tearing roar. The sound sliced violently through the heavy, humid air of the isolated mangrove swamp. Cameron and Meredith were pushing the small outboard motor to its absolute maximum capacity. The impending deadline from the underground lending syndicate had clearly fractured their nerves, forcing them into a rushed, panicked timeline. They needed a corpse immediately to satisfy the insurance conglomerate. I had less than 2 minutes before they boarded the hull. I spun away from the shattered glass of the main salon doors and moved swiftly back into the master stateroom. The leather folio containing the forged $5 million life insurance policy and the aggressive syndicate final notices rested heavily on the writing desk. This collection of papers was the only tangible proof of their premeditated murder plot. Without these documents, my survival would simply be framed as the confused wandering of an elderly man suffering from severe dementia. I needed a highly secure transport method. My eyes scanned the expansive, custom-built cedar closet. On the top shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of expensive resort wear, I spotted a heavy-duty marine-grade dry bag. The thick yellow vinyl was designed specifically to protect sensitive electronics from total submersion. I snatched the bag and forced the heavy leather folio deep inside. I rolled the top nylon collar down tightly, executing 4 precise folds before snapping the heavy plastic buckles together. The airtight seal engaged with a solid, reassuring click. I strapped the bag securely across my chest, pulling the nylon webbing tight until the rigid vinyl pressed firmly against my ribcage. The evidence was permanently secured. My immediate tactical priority shifted back to the primary hatch of the auxiliary hold. If Cameron discovered the scorched wiring and the violently bypassed magnetic lock, he would instantly realize that I had escaped utilizing advanced mechanical expertise. He would know I was alive, aware, and highly dangerous. He would immediately initiate a localized hunt. I needed him to believe the ocean had simply claimed me, or more preferably that the yacht itself had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. I moved rapidly down the narrow lower corridor. The distinct acrid odor of melted plastic and scorched copper still hung heavily in the stagnant, sweltering air. I knelt on the polished mahogany floorboards in front of the heavy aluminum door. The polycarbonate housing of the magnetic lock was severely warped and blackened from the intense electrical short circuit I had forced earlier. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the heavy titanium buckle of my leather belt. I wedged the flat, rigid edge against the warped plastic and applied brutal downward force, bending the melted casing back into its original alignment to hide the most obvious burn marks. I reached blindly into the dark, stifling auxiliary hold and scraped my bare hand along the base of the secondary backup generator. My fingers gathered a thick, heavy mound of black industrial motor grease. I pulled my hand back and systematically smeared the dense sludge over the exposed copper wires and the fractured locking mechanism. I packed the broken latch tightly with the thick grease thoroughly masking the aggressive electrical burns. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and forced the aluminum door shut. The damaged locking pins ground against the frame before clicking into place, held together entirely by friction and the dense industrial sludge. To the untrained eye of a panicked sales manager, the heavy door would simply appear to have suffered a massive mechanical seizure under the intense, expanding heat of the Florida sun. It would register as a tragic malfunction of a complex vessel, leaving him utterly confused as to how the hold was now empty. The roar of the outboard motor was now absolutely deafening, echoing sharply off the dense, overgrown roots of the surrounding mangrove trees. I moved with urgent precision toward the starboard side of the main deck, keeping my physical silhouette incredibly low to avoid casting any revealing shadows across the dark water. Through the gaps in the dense vegetation, I spotted a rusted, decaying wooden pier jutting out from the muddy shoreline approximately 50 yards away. The wooden pilings were severely eroded, completely covered in thick green algae and sharp calcified barnacles. It was the absolute perfect tactical blind spot. I slipped silently over the polished fiberglass railing. I did not dive. A sudden splash or a disruption of the surface tension would draw immediate visual attention from the approaching dinghy. I lowered my 69-year-old body slowly down the side of the hull, letting the warm, murky swamp water swallow me inch by inch. The dense salt water immediately attacked the raw electrical burns on my forearms, sending sharp, searing waves of pain up to my shoulders. I completely ignored the agonizing sensation. I released my grip on the yacht and submerged myself entirely. The water in the isolated cove was heavily clouded with thick sediment and decaying organic matter. Visibility was absolutely zero. I relied entirely on decades of ingrained naval survival training, executing a flawless, entirely silent breaststroke beneath the surface. I kept my movements smooth and highly controlled, minimizing underwater turbulence. When my lungs demanded oxygen, I broke the surface tension with only my nose and mouth drawing in shallow, measured breaths before slipping back into the murky darkness. The physical exertion demanded a massive toll on my dehydrated, exhausted muscles, but the pure, unadulterated rage burning in my chest propelled me forward. I was no longer a victim waiting to die in a steel box. I was a chief engineer executing a counteroffensive. My outstretched hands finally struck the hard, unyielding surface of the wooden pilings. I wrapped my arms around the decaying wood, feeling the razor-sharp edges of the barnacles instantly slice deeply into my palms and forearms. Warm blood mixed freely with the dark swamp water, but I locked my grip with absolute iron determination. I pressed my entire body flat against the slimy wood, camouflaging myself completely within the deep, impenetrable shadows cast by the overhanging mangrove canopy. I slowed my breathing to a silent, steady rhythm. From this concealed vantage point, I possessed a perfect unobstructed view of the yacht's aft deck. The motorized dinghy rounded the rear of the yacht and slammed violently against the pristine white fiberglass hull. Cameron instantly killed the outboard engine. The sudden heavy silence of the swamp was immediately shattered by the frantic, chaotic sounds of Cameron scrambling desperately onto the teakwood deck. He moved with the erratic, uncoordinated energy of a man completely consumed by dark anticipation. Meredith remained seated in the small dinghy, her knuckles turning white as she clutched her expensive designer purse against her chest. Her face was incredibly pale, entirely stripped of the arrogant, predatory smirk she had worn hours earlier. The reality of their actions was clearly crashing down upon her. Cameron sprinted directly across the aft lounge and threw himself down the narrow stairs toward the lower corridor. From the dark water, I watched his frantic movements through the shattered glass doors of the main salon. I saw him slide uncontrollably on the polished floorboards before slamming his hands against the heavy handle of the auxiliary hold. He did not hesitate. He braced his legs against the bulkhead and threw his entire body weight backward, pulling furiously on the handle. He was fully preparing himself to stare down at the baked, lifeless corpse of his own father. The heavily greased latch offered zero resistance. The heavy aluminum door swung wide open, slamming loudly against the interior wall. A second of absolute, terrifying silence hung heavy over the dark water. Cameron stood perfectly frozen in the doorway, staring blankly into the pitch-black void. Then a raw, visceral scream of pure, unadulterated panic erupted violently from his throat. The sound tore through the quiet swamp, echoing endlessly across the water. It was not a shout of confusion. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of a predator suddenly realizing he was standing entirely alone in the dark, and the trap he had built was completely empty. Cameron's scream faded rapidly into the dense, suffocating canopy of the mangrove swamp. I did not linger in the dark water to watch his panic evolve into desperate realization. I turned my back to the decaying pilings and began the grueling navigation inland. The Florida coastal scrubland was an unforgiving, hostile terrain composed entirely of razor-sharp sawgrass, sinking black mud, and sweltering humidity. Every single step demanded a massive withdrawal from my rapidly depleting physical reserves. My heavy leather shoes squelched loudly in the brackish muck, slowing my forward momentum. The stagnant salt water burned fiercely across the fresh, jagged lacerations on my palms and forearms caused by the barnacles. I ignored the localized pain completely. I channeled the searing, intense rage burning in the center of my chest directly into my leg muscles. I had a singular tactical objective. I needed secure, untraceable communication to establish my counteroffensive. After 40 agonizing minutes of breaking through the treacherous underbrush, the dense coastal vegetation finally gave way to cracked, sun-bleached asphalt. I stood on the dusty shoulder of a desolate two-lane state highway, shimmering under the oppressive late-afternoon sun. A quarter-mile down the entirely empty road, the faded, buzzing neon sign of an independent gas station flickered weakly against the glaring blue sky. I moved toward the isolated structure with a steady, measured military marching cadence, absolutely refusing to allow physical exhaustion to compromise my upright posture. The station appeared practically abandoned. A single uninterested clerk dozed heavily behind the counter inside the fortified glass booth. Mounted securely to the exterior brick wall, heavily oxidized by decades of relentless salt air, hung a fully operational public payphone. I reached into my soaked trouser pocket and retrieved a single, relatively dry quarter I always carried precisely for unforeseen emergencies. I fed the silver coin into the rusted mechanical slot and dialed a private, highly secure unlisted number strictly from memory. The secure line rang exactly twice before a sharp, commanding voice answered. Oliver Hayes was currently recognized as one of the most highly lethal and ruthlessly effective corporate litigators operating in the state of Florida. 25 years ago, however, he was a young, aggressively sharp Navy JAG officer assigned directly to my Pacific submarine fleet. We had navigated the exceptionally treacherous waters of classified military tribunals and highly volatile hostile deployments together. We did not exchange pleasantries. We never did. Oliver, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of panic despite my raw throat. Initiate protocol blackout. Effective immediately. A brief, heavy silence stretched tautly across the encrypted line. Oliver processed the severe command instantly. His mind shifted gears from civilian law directly back to military crisis management. Garrison. Where exactly are you located? The Regional Coast Guard Maritime Alert just crossed the emergency wire 10 minutes ago. They are officially stating you fell overboard in open water. I am currently standing on solid dry land, I replied coldly, gripping the heavy plastic receiver. Cameron and his wife attempted a premeditated execution by hyperthermia. They deliberately locked me inside the sealed auxiliary equipment hold of their newly purchased yacht during peak afternoon temperatures. They previously fabricated a $5 million life insurance policy featuring a flawless forged signature. The physical documentation proving their treason is currently secured inside a waterproof dry bag strapped tightly against my chest. Oliver exhaled sharply through his nose. The faint sound carried the distinct, unmistakable edge of an apex predator catching the fresh scent of blood. Understood. Are you physically compromised in any way? I am entirely operational, I assured him. But officially, I need to remain completely dead to the outside world. While I maintained my tight grip on the heavy plastic receiver, my eyes locked intensely onto the small, dust-covered television monitor mounted securely behind the thick glass of the gas station window. The screen abruptly shifted from a local commercial to display the bright red flashing banner of a local news-breaking broadcast. The volume was entirely muted through the thick safety glass, but the visual narrative unfolding on the screen was crystal clear. The local news camera crews were clustered tightly together around the polished mahogany entrance of the Miami Harbor Master's official office. Cameron stood squarely at the center of the flashing media circus. His previously pristine white linen outfit was now intentionally rumpled and stained with salt water. His carefully styled hair was aggressively disheveled. He gripped the wooden edges of the public podium with white, trembling knuckles, performing the demanding role of a devastated, heartbroken son with sickening, calculated precision. He wept openly in front of the flashing cameras, repeatedly wiping manufactured tears from his flushed cheeks. The urgent news chyrons scrolling rapidly across the bottom of the digital screen summarized his treacherous, carefully rehearsed lie. The bold text stated the surviving son claimed his father suffered from severe, undocumented, and rapidly advancing dementia. The narrative claimed I had become hopelessly disoriented in the severe heat, wandered aimlessly off the aft deck, and tragically vanished into the deep, unforgiving ocean currents. Meredith stood directly behind his right shoulder, perfectly completing the public alibi. She wore an oversized pair of dark designer sunglasses, concealing her eyes entirely from the media scrutiny. She stroked Cameron's shaking back with slow, deliberate, highly visible, comforting motions. She played the deeply traumatized, supportive daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. She was aggressively projecting an unwavering image of tight family unity and sudden, unbearable grief. Her physical performance was a terrifying masterclass in psychological manipulation. The entire charade was designed specifically to preempt any official police investigation into their underlying financial motives. By publicly branding me as a confused, senile, and declining old man, they actively erased any immediate suspicion of foul play. The general public eagerly consumes a tragic, unavoidable accident. Law enforcement agencies rarely look for a complex murder plot when the weeping wealthy family eagerly provides them with a heartbreaking, highly plausible medical explanation. They had constructed an impenetrable shield of public sympathy to guard their impending financial windfall. They are running a live press conference right now on the local affiliate, I told Oliver, staring with cold intensity at the flickering television screen. Cameron is weaponizing a fake dementia diagnosis to explain my disappearance. He is claiming I simply wandered overboard in a state of severe mental confusion. I am looking at the exact same live broadcast on my office monitor, Oliver replied, his professional tone dropping instantly into a dangerous icy register. The United States Coast Guard just released their official public statement regarding the incident. They are currently launching a massive multi-agency search and rescue operation across the entire coastal sector. They have already deployed 2 MH-60 Jayhawk helicopters and 4 rapid response maritime boats to scour the ocean surface. The local news anchor reappeared on the screen, his face grave, serious, and appropriately somber. The bold yellow text flashing below his desk finalized my current binding legal status. Garrison Cole was officially declared a missing person presumed dead at sea. The massive bureaucratic machine had been fully activated based entirely on my son's malicious lie. The trap they had so carefully built was now fully operational, securing their public innocence. They firmly believed they had successfully eliminated their primary obstacle and secured their $5 million salvation. They believed the deep ocean had swallowed their sins entirely, but they had tragically miscalculated the resilience of a trained engineer. They had locked the door, emptied the extinguisher, and sailed away, absolutely certain of their lethal victory. They were currently weeping for a dead man. They had absolutely no idea they had just caught a ghost. I left the desolate gas station behind, stepping back into the oppressive heat of the Florida afternoon. The television screen had confirmed my new reality. I was officially a ghost, a tragic victim of a manufactured dementia wandering the ocean currents. My son and his wife had successfully executed the public phase of their operation. Now it was time to execute the silent, subterranean phase of mine. I walked 2 miles down the cracked asphalt shoulder of the state highway until I reached a busy commercial intersection. I paid for a taxi using the damp emergency cash I always kept sealed in a small plastic sleeve inside my wallet. I directed the driver to a sprawling corporate park situated on the edge of the financial district. I did not enter through the grand glass atrium of the main building. I navigated the perimeter and utilized a secure biometric service entrance designated specifically for executive partners. Oliver Hayes occupied the entire top floor of the high-rise. His private office was a fortress of polished mahogany, soundproofed glass, and absolute discretion. I bypassed the receptionist using an old security code Oliver had given me a decade ago for extreme emergencies. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the pristine, climate-controlled sanctuary. My appearance was a violent disruption to the sterile environment. My clothes were stained with black swamp mud and dried motor grease. My forearms were wrapped in improvised bandages, torn from my undershirt, hiding the deep lacerations inflicted by the barnacles. I smelled heavily of stagnant salt water and ozone. Oliver sat behind his massive desk, reviewing a stack of legal briefs. He looked up. For a fraction of a second, absolute shock registered in his sharp gray eyes. He had undoubtedly seen the same breaking news broadcast declaring me lost at sea. But Oliver was a man forged in the exact same naval crucibles I was. The shock vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating professional focus. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not ask how I survived. He recognized immediately that a hostile engagement was actively underway. He stood up, locked the deadbolt on his office doors, and activated the electronic privacy frosting on the glass walls. I walked directly to his desk. I unbuckled the heavy plastic clasps of the yellow marine dry bag strapped to my chest. I pulled out the thick leather folio and dropped it heavily onto the pristine mahogany surface. The damp leather slapped loudly against the wood. They initiated a premeditated execution this afternoon. I said, my voice harsh and raspy from the smoke and dehydration. Cameron and Meredith locked me inside the sealed auxiliary equipment hold of their new yacht. They disabled the ventilation and emptied the fire extinguisher. They intended for me to die of heat stroke while they established a public alibi ashore. They are currently broadcasting a completely fabricated story regarding my mental health to the local media to preempt any official police investigation. Oliver did not utter a single word of disbelief. He pulled the leather folio toward him and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the aggressive final notices from the underground lending syndicate. He quickly processed the terrifying numerical data. He saw the massive balloon payment of $800,000 due in less than 72 hours. Then he turned to the pristine contract from the global insurance conglomerate. He stared intensely at the newly minted $5 million life insurance policy. His gaze locked onto the bottom line of the final page. "The signature is a flawless forgery," I stated flatly. "They leveraged my life to cover his catastrophic syndicate debt. They require a corpse to satisfy the insurance payout. They believe they have successfully secured that corpse." "This is not merely financial desperation," Oliver said, his voice dropping into a dangerous clinical register. "This is an orchestrated, high-level conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. They have weaponized the legal and medical systems to facilitate your assassination. We possess the physical evidence to send them both to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. I can contact the district attorney right now and have heavily armed tactical units waiting for them when they step off that yacht." I shook my head slowly. "No. An immediate arrest is entirely too swift. An immediate arrest allows them to play the victims of a tragic misunderstanding. It allows Meredith to blame Cameron and Cameron to blame Meredith. They believed they could strip away my life, my resources, and my dignity with absolute impunity. I will not simply hand them over to the police. I am going to systematically dismantle their entire world from the inside out. I am going to force them to feel the exact same suffocating panic they forced me to endure in that pitch-black hold." Oliver closed the leather folio. The predatory glint returned to his eyes. He understood the tactical objective completely. "What are your specific orders, Garrison?" "I need you to sever their financial lifelines completely," I commanded. "I need an absolute legal blackout." Oliver sat back down behind his desk and pulled his encrypted keyboard toward him. "The legal blackout is the nuclear option of probate and trust law. It is a highly classified, heavily fortified defensive maneuver we established 5 years ago, when I first transferred my primary assets into a blind, irrevocable trust. It was designed to protect the estate from hostile corporate takeovers or severe identity theft." Oliver's fingers flew rapidly across the keys, bypassing standard civilian legal channels and accessing the deep, secure federal banking networks. "I am invoking the emergency incapacitation clause," Oliver explained, his eyes fixed on the dual monitors illuminating his face. "I am officially freezing your entire estate, your primary trust funds, and every single property deed registered under your name. This process operates entirely in the shadows. There will be no public record of this freeze. To a standard bank teller or an automated financial system, the accounts will simply appear normal, but utterly inaccessible. Any attempt to withdraw funds, transfer capital, or liquidate assets will be met with a silent decline. More importantly, any aggressive repeated attempt to breach these specific accounts will instantly trigger an automatic high-level federal fraud alert directly to the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Cameron and Meredith were currently operating under the absolute certainty that my death would immediately unlock the floodgates of my wealth. They believed the fabricated life insurance policy was their ultimate salvation, but they also firmly expected my standard checking and savings accounts to serve as an immediate liquid bridge loan to float their lavish lifestyle until the massive insurance check officially cleared. They had grown completely accustomed to living off the generous automated safety net I had foolishly provided for them over the past decade. "The lockdown is complete," Oliver stated, hitting the final execution key. "Every single cent you own is now encased in impenetrable legal concrete. Cameron could walk into any bank in the country with a certified death certificate, and he would not be able to extract a single dime to buy a cup of coffee. He is completely severed from your resources." "Excellent," I said, leaning forward against the edge of the desk. "Now we initiate the offensive strike. We target his immediate vulnerability." Cameron's entire false empire was built on leverage and fragile credit. The crown jewel of his fake success was the luxury yacht. I knew exactly how he structured his finances. He lacked the discipline to manage manual payments. He relied entirely on automated digital drafts linked directly to a joint account that heavily depended on my previous monthly cash infusions. The monthly mortgage payment for a dual-engine yacht of that magnitude was absolutely staggering. Orchestrate a specific targeted digital interception, I instructed Oliver. I want you to manipulate the routing numbers connecting his primary checking account to his maritime lender. I want his next automated payment to fail catastrophically. Oliver's fingers resumed their rapid assault on the keyboard. He navigated the complex digital pathways linking the financial institutions. He was a master of exploiting bureaucratic loopholes and manipulating banking software. He isolated the specific recurring payment profile associated with the yacht's marine mortgage. I am injecting a temporary digital block on the routing sequence, Oliver confirmed. The scheduled automated draft for his vessel is queued for processing at the close of the business day. When the lender's system attempts to extract the monthly mortgage payment from Cameron's account, it will encounter a solid brick wall. Make sure the notification is brutal and immediate, I demanded. I do not want a polite warning regarding a minor processing error. I want him to receive a definitive, undeniable declaration of his financial failure. Oliver executed the final line of code. The digital trap was successfully armed and waiting. The scheduled auto draft will execute in exactly 15 minutes. The transaction will bounce violently. Cameron's bank will immediately generate an automated alert. He will receive an email explicitly stating that the transaction was severely declined due to grossly insufficient funds. The maritime lender will simultaneously receive an alert regarding the failed payment, instantly flagging the multi-million-dollar asset for potential delinquency. I stood tall, feeling the sharp sting of the barnacle cuts on my arms, but ignoring the pain completely. Cameron and Meredith were currently basking in the false glory of their perfect crime. They believed they had successfully murdered me. They believed they had fooled the entire world. They believed they were about to step into a future of unlimited, unearned wealth. But the reality was rapidly shifting beneath their feet. The money was gone. The safety net was permanently destroyed. In exactly 15 minutes, my son would look down at his phone and read the very first undeniable proof that his carefully constructed empire of lies was beginning to collapse. The silent lockdown was complete. The hunting season had officially begun. The digital chime of a priority email severed the quiet hum of the luxury restaurant. Cameron Cole sat rigidly at a corner table of a Michelin-starred seafood establishment in South Beach. He stared blindly at the glowing screen of his smartphone. The sender was the automated billing department of his maritime lender. The subject line was highlighted in a bright hostile red font. It declared a catastrophic payment failure. The monthly auto draft for his multi-million-dollar yacht had bounced violently. The notification explicitly cited grossly insufficient funds. Cameron frantically opened his primary banking application. His thumb left a smear of sweat across the glass. The loading icon spun for 2 agonizing seconds before revealing his account dashboard. The balance on his primary checking account displayed a flat 0. His secondary savings account, heavily reliant on the automated financial safety net his father had established a decade ago, was entirely locked. A generic system error code replaced his available balance. He refreshed the application 3 consecutive times. The numbers refused to change. The impenetrable legal concrete Oliver Hayes had poured over the estate was fully active, completely invisible, and utterly devastating. The maritime lender's email outlined the immediate consequences. A secondary attempt to draft the funds would occur in 24 hours. If that transaction failed, the account would enter formal delinquency, triggering an immediate asset seizure protocol. Cameron felt the blood drain entirely from his face. The crushing weight of the $800,000 balloon payment owed to the underground lending syndicate pressed heavily against his chest. He was completely broke, heavily monitored by dangerous men, and rapidly running out of time. He looked across the table. Meredith sat in serene manufactured mourning. She wore a tailored black designer dress that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, delicately wiping away a non-existent tear whenever a waiter passed by their secluded alcove. She was thoroughly enjoying the luxurious performance of the devastated widow. She had completely insulated herself from the mechanical realities of their financial collapse. Cameron quickly shoved his phone face down onto the white linen tablecloth. He reached for his scotch glass and swallowed the amber liquid in a single desperate gulp. The alcohol burned his throat, but completely failed to steady his violently shaking hands. He needed to maintain the illusion of control. If Meredith discovered the banking lockdown right now, her carefully constructed facade would shatter in the middle of a crowded dining room. "Are you quite finished staring at your screen?" Meredith asked, her voice dropping its sorrowful pitch to deliver a sharp, icy reprimand. "People are watching us, Cameron. You need to look appropriately traumatized. Your father just died a tragic, highly publicized death at sea. Stop acting like a distracted teenager and order another bottle of the Dom Perignon." Cameron signaled the sommelier with a jerky, uncoordinated wave. He ordered the $1,000 bottle without looking at the price. The evening dragged on in a suffocating haze of anxiety. Meredith ordered the imported caviar, the Wagyu beef, and an array of expensive appetizers she barely touched. She was celebrating their perceived victory over the stubborn old man they had locked inside a baking steel box. Cameron forced himself to eat, his stomach churning violently with every bite. The phantom specter of his father's empty bank accounts haunted his every thought. The waiter eventually approached their table carrying a slim black leather folder. He placed it discreetly near Cameron's right elbow. The total bill exceeded $3,000. Cameron pulled his heavy metal black credit card from his designer wallet. He dropped it onto the small silver tray with an artificial flourish of absolute confidence. He handed the folder back to the waiter, desperately praying the card carried enough revolving credit to clear the massive charge. The waiter bowed slightly and retreated toward the service station. Cameron held his breath. 5 excruciating minutes passed. The elegant dining room felt like a pressurized submarine hull. The waiter returned his posture entirely stripped of its previous deference. He held the black metal card between 2 fingers. He leaned down, pitching his voice to a discreet, highly professional whisper that nevertheless echoed loudly in Cameron's ears. "I apologize sincerely, sir," the waiter stated. "The merchant terminal has declined this transaction. The bank has requested that we hold the card, but I am returning it to you as a professional courtesy. Do you happen to have an alternative method of payment?" Cameron felt a cold sweat break out across his entire body. He snatched the card from the waiter's hand. He forced a loud, artificial laugh that drew the attention of the adjacent tables. "There must be a ridiculous security hold on the account," Cameron declared, his voice pitching entirely too high. "My bank is notoriously overprotective regarding unusual spending patterns following a sudden family tragedy. Run the card again. Force the transaction through the manual terminal." The waiter maintained his neutral, unyielding expression. "I have already attempted the transaction through 3 separate terminals, sir. The rejection code is absolute. The account is completely locked." Meredith's eyes snapped toward Cameron. The delicate grieving widow routine vanished instantly, replaced by a cold reptilian glare. She recognized the scent of incompetence immediately. Without uttering a single word, she reached into her black leather clutch and retrieved her own platinum emergency credit card. She threw the plastic onto the silver tray with a sharp, aggressive flick of her wrist. "Run this immediately," Meredith commanded the waiter. The transaction cleared in seconds. Meredith did not wait for the receipt. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She grabbed Cameron firmly by the bicep. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug viciously through the thin fabric of his shirt, sinking deep into his muscle tissue. She maintained a tight, artificial smile for the surrounding patrons as she physically dragged her husband away from the table. She completely bypassed the grand main entrance, hauling him directly through the swinging doors of the kitchen and out into the humid, garbage-strewn alleyway behind the restaurant. The heavy metal service door slammed shut, cutting off the ambient noise of the dining room. The alley smelled of rotting seafood and hot asphalt. Meredith shoved Cameron violently against the rough brick wall. Her voice dropped into a venomous, furious hiss. "What is wrong with your accounts?" Meredith demanded, her eyes wide with unadulterated rage. "We just successfully executed the most dangerous maneuver of our entire lives, and you cannot even manage a simple dinner bill." Cameron rubbed his bruising arm, his bravado entirely shattered. "My primary accounts are completely frozen." The auto draft for the yacht bounced an hour ago. The bank is refusing all transactions. I think the probate court automatically locked his estate funds the second the Coast Guard issued the missing person declaration. Meredith stepped closer, invading his personal space. You absolute fool, she whispered. We do not have time to wait for a probate judge to unthaw your father's standard checking accounts. I saw a black, heavily tinted SUV parked directly across the street from our condominium complex this morning. The driver did not move for 4 hours. The syndicate enforcers are no longer waiting patiently for their balloon payment. They are actively tracking our movements. They know you bought a multi-million-dollar boat. If we do not deliver $800,000 in cash by Friday, they will strip our assets and bury us in the Everglades. Cameron's breathing accelerated into a hyperventilating panic. I cannot access the cash. The digital routing is completely blocked. I have zero liquidity. Then you bypass the standard banks entirely, Meredith ordered, pointing a sharp finger directly at his chest. You pull out your phone right now. You contact the private broker who finalized the $5 million life insurance policy. We possess a binding legal contract. Your father is officially presumed dead by a federal maritime agency. You demand an immediate emergency disbursement of the policy funds to cover his estate processing costs. You do not ask. You dictate terms. Cameron pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands shook so violently he dropped the device onto the cracked asphalt. He scrambled to retrieve it, his pristine white pants scraping against the dirty ground. He unlocked the screen and navigated to his contacts. He found the private unlisted number of the senior insurance broker who had approved the forged application. He pressed the dial icon and held the phone to his ear. The line rang 3 times. A sharp, clinically detached voice answered. Cameron immediately launched into his rehearsed authoritative demand. He projected the false confidence of a grieving heir, citing the official Coast Guard search and rescue reports. He demanded an immediate partial release of the $5 million death benefit to facilitate emergency family arrangements. He stopped speaking. He listened to the broker's response. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He lowered the phone slowly from his ear, his jaw hanging slightly open. What did he say? Meredith demanded, grabbing his shoulder again. Tell me he authorized the wire transfer. Cameron stared blindly at the brick wall behind his wife. The warm Miami wind whipping through the alleyway felt like absolute ice against his sweating skin. The phantom specter of his father's flawless engineering had just sealed their doom. The policy is completely valid, Cameron whispered, his voice completely hollowed out by absolute despair. But the Coast Guard declaration holds absolutely zero immediate financial weight. The missing person status initiates a mandatory standard waiting period of 7 full years before a payout can be legally authorized. Meredith's face contorted in shock. 7 years. Tell them to bypass the waiting period. Tell them it is an emergency. Cameron shook his head slowly. The broker outlined the strict federal regulations. To bypass the 7-year waiting period and release a $5 million payout today, the insurance conglomerate requires indisputable biological proof of death. They require a physical corpse, or they require a certified death certificate legally signed and stamped by a county medical examiner. The full crushing reality of their situation collapsed squarely upon their shoulders. They had locked Garrison Cole in a steel box and abandoned the vessel specifically to avoid leaving any physical evidence of their crime. They had designed a murder that produced no body. They had built the perfect trap only to realize they had locked themselves permanently inside it. They had absolutely no corpse to present to the insurance agency. They possessed no certified medical documents. They had absolutely nothing to offer the syndicate enforcers waiting outside their home. The cracks in their facade had officially shattered the entire structure. The crushing reality of the 7-year waiting period completely shattered the last remaining fragments of Cameron's arrogant composure. He slumped against the damp brick wall of the restaurant alleyway, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his failure. The $5 million life insurance policy, the singular prize that justified patricide, was practically useless without a physical corpse or a legally certified death certificate. The syndicate enforcers waiting outside his condominium would not accept promises or bureaucratic delays. They demanded $800,000 in immediate liquid cash, and they possessed the violent means to extract it from his flesh. Meredith did not share his paralyzing despair. Her survival instinct was entirely devoid of morality, operating purely on cold, ruthless pragmatism. She understood immediately that the legitimate avenues for claiming the insurance payout were permanently closed. Therefore, they needed to manufacture their own legitimacy. She grabbed Cameron by the lapels of his expensive saltwater-stained shirt and hoisted him to his feet. She dictated their next maneuver with absolute terrifying clarity. They were going to cross a definitive, irredeemable legal boundary. They were going to purchase a ghost. The following morning, I sat securely inside Oliver Hayes's fortified mahogany office, watching their desperate operation unfold in real time. Oliver's lead private investigator, a former military intelligence operative named Vance, had successfully cloned Cameron's cellular GPS signal overnight. We tracked their movements across Miami as they scrambled to scrape together the necessary capital for their black market transaction. The silent lockdown of my financial estate had worked flawlessly, forcing Meredith to resort to extreme measures. She spent the early hours of the morning visiting 3 separate high-end pawnbrokers in the Diamond District. She liquidated her engagement ring, several diamond tennis bracelets, and a vintage Rolex watch Cameron had purchased using my previously stolen funds. She managed to convert her symbols of manufactured wealth into $10,000 of untraceable bundled cash. With the capital secured, they drove entirely off the grid. Vance tracked their vehicle to a deeply decaying, sun-bleached motel located on the absolute outer fringes of the Miami-Dade County limits. The area was a notorious haven for narcotics trafficking and illicit off-the-books transactions. It was the exact environment where desperate people went to disappear, or in Cameron's case, to forcefully alter the official bureaucratic record. They parked their luxury sedan behind a rusted dumpster, looking entirely out of place in their designer clothing. Vance was already perfectly positioned. He had arrived 10 minutes prior, parking an unassuming utility van directly across the narrow street. He deployed a high-definition long-range telephoto camera lens and a highly sensitive parabolic microphone, aiming the equipment precisely at the cracked window of room number 4. The air conditioning unit in the motel room was visibly broken, forcing the occupants to leave the rear window partially open to combat the oppressive, stagnant Florida heat. It was a fatal operational security flaw. From the safety of Oliver's office monitor, I watched the live feed with cold, calculated precision. The high-definition camera pierced the dirty window pane, delivering a crystal-clear view of the sordid interior. Cameron and Meredith stood rigidly inside the cramped, smoke-stained room. Seated across from them at a cheap laminate table was Dr. Elias Thorne. Thorne was a heavily disgraced, stripped medical professional. He had lost his state medical license a decade ago for operating a highly lucrative illegal prescription pill mill. Now he utilized his lingering connections and stolen medical credentials to cater to the desperate, providing fabricated medical documentation, illicit surgeries, and forged bureaucratic miracles to the criminal underworld. Thorne did not ask for the emotional backstory of my disappearance. He dealt strictly in absolute risk and cash compensation. Through the crisp audio feed of the parabolic microphone, I listened as Meredith ruthlessly laid out their exact requirements. She did not show a single ounce of hesitation or grief. She outlined the parameters with chilling efficiency. "We require a comprehensive ironclad medical history," Meredith commanded, her voice cutting sharply through the humming static of the motel room. "The file must be meticulously backdated over the course of the last 18 months. It needs to show a rapid, aggressive onset of Lewy body dementia. You will include detailed clinical notes indicating severe nocturnal wandering, intense visual hallucinations, and a total loss of spatial awareness. The narrative must perfectly support a tragic, unavoidable, accidental drowning." Thorne leaned back in his rusted folding chair, tapping a nicotine-stained finger against the laminate table. He understood the profound legal gravity of what she was requesting. Fabricating a medical history was a serious offense, but it was merely the preamble to their ultimate goal. A retroactive dementia diagnosis will appease the local police detectives, Thorne replied, his voice gravelly and low. It provides a neat, tidy explanation for an old man falling off a boat. But a medical file does not trigger a $5 million corporate insurance payout. You are asking me to produce a certified death certificate without a physical body to autopsy. That requires accessing the county coroner's secure digital portal. It requires utilizing stolen cryptographic signatures to bypass the Federal Vital Records Registry. If the insurance conglomerate audits that document and discovers the forgery, the resulting federal wire fraud charges carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Meredith did not blink. She reached into her expensive designer purse and retrieved the thick banded stack of $100 bills. She threw the heavy stack onto the table. It landed with a solid, undeniable thud directly in front of Thorne. $10,000 in untraceable cash, she stated coldly. You assume the digital risk and we walk away with the paperwork necessary to satisfy the insurance board. Cameron stood silently beside his wife, looking physically ill. He was sweating profusely in the stifling heat of the room, his eyes darting nervously toward the thin motel door. He was fully aware that he was actively crossing a point of no return. By participating in this specific transaction, he was elevating his crime from simple neglect and attempted murder to a massive, highly documented federal conspiracy to commit wire fraud and insurance fraud. But the paralyzing fear of the syndicate enforcers outweighed his fear of the federal government. He remained completely silent, implicitly endorsing the felony. Thorne stared at the thick stack of cash. The inherent greed that had originally destroyed his legitimate medical career effortlessly overpowered his cautious instincts. He reached out and pulled the banded bills toward his chest. He thumbed through the stack with practiced rapid precision, verifying the amount, before dropping the money into a battered leather briefcase resting on the stained carpet. Give me the exact biographical details, Thorne instructed, pulling a sleek, high-end laptop from the briefcase. Full legal name, date of birth, social security number, and the exact coordinates provided to the Coast Guard search and rescue teams. I will route the forged death certificate through a compromised terminal at the Regional Medical Examiner's office. The document will carry the official county seal and a verified digital tracking number. The insurance company will run it through their automated verification system, and it will return as absolute undeniable fact. I sat perfectly still in the pristine, air-conditioned comfort of Oliver's office, watching Thorne's fingers fly across his keyboard. He was actively constructing the official bureaucratic proof of my demise. He was meticulously typing out the fabricated clinical notes detailing my supposed mental decline. He was signing my life away using stolen credentials, wrapping my entire existence into a neat, highly profitable lie. The live surveillance feed captured every single keystroke, every hushed negotiation, and the undeniable physical exchange of the illicit cash. Vance was currently recording the interaction from 3 separate angles, ensuring the audio and visual data was completely synchronized and undeniably admissible in a federal court of law. The evidence was simultaneously uploading to Oliver's encrypted servers, creating a permanent, indestructible record of their felony. 20 minutes later, Thorne hit the final execution key. A small portable laser printer sitting on the edge of the laminate table hummed to life. It slowly fed out 2 pristine, heavily stamped sheets of official county paper. One document was the comprehensive, backdated medical history outlining a severe case of dementia. The second document was a certified, legally binding death certificate officially declaring Garrison Cole dead by accidental drowning. Meredith snatched the warm papers directly from the printer tray. She reviewed the forged seals with a predatory, triumphant gleam in her eye. She carefully folded the documents and placed them securely inside her purse. She grabbed Cameron by the arm and pulled him toward the door. They exited the motel room with renewed, arrogant confidence. They firmly believed they had just successfully purchased their salvation. They believed the forged paperwork was the final impenetrable shield that would protect them from the syndicate and unlock their $5 million windfall. They had absolutely no idea that they had just walked blindly into a highly orchestrated federal trap. By actively purchasing forged government documents to defraud an interstate insurance conglomerate, they had officially escalated their crimes to a federal level. They were no longer simply fighting for money, they were now unknowingly fighting for their freedom. I watched their luxury sedan pull away from the decaying motel, entirely unaware of the surveillance van tracking their departure. The snare was now fully armed, the evidence was permanently secured, and the final phase of their total destruction was about to begin. Vance's surveillance feed went entirely dark, the digital transfer of the felony evidence fully secured within Oliver's encrypted servers. The federal snare was now perfectly constructed, armed, and completely invisible. The United States government possessed everything necessary to lock my son and his wife in a federal penitentiary for the remainder of their natural lives. However, a sterile courtroom conviction was insufficient. A bureaucratic arrest would simply transfer them from a luxury condominium to a holding cell. It would completely bypass the visceral, suffocating terror they had so callously inflicted upon me. I required a specialized form of psychological dismantling. I needed to break Meredith's iron grip on the situation. She was the ruthless architect of their emotional resilience, the one who had guided Cameron into purchasing a forged death certificate. If I shattered her icy composure, Cameron's fragile psyche would instantly crumble beneath the pressure. 3 years ago, when Cameron utilized my stolen funds to purchase his high-rise luxury condominium in Brickell, he complained endlessly about the exorbitant installation costs of a comprehensive smart home network. I had stepped in utilizing my decades of naval engineering background to design and hardwire the entire localized system from the ground up. I personally mapped the climate controls, the integrated security protocols, the localized audiovisual network, and the automated window treatments. Cameron, completely devoid of technical discipline and blinded by his extreme arrogance, never bothered to change the master administrator override codes I established during the initial boot sequence. He simply wanted the superficial luxury of controlling his lighting with a smartphone application. He never understood the complex digital doors he had left wide open for me. I remained seated in Oliver's private office, utilizing an untraceable heavy-duty encrypted laptop provided by Vance. I accessed the primary commercial gateway and entered the default string of alphanumeric characters. The system accepted the master credentials instantly. The entire digital blueprint of my son's residence materialized on the glowing screen. The interface displayed every active motion sensor, every thermal reading, and the operational status of every connected device within the expansive penthouse. The digital clock in the lower corner of my screen ticked silently toward 3 a.m. They were currently asleep, thoroughly exhausted from the massive adrenaline expenditure of actively committing a federal felony. They believed they were safe behind locked doors and a manufactured medical history. They believed the nightmare was over. I initiated the primary sequence. I targeted the centralized HVAC network first. I bypassed the localized wall thermostats, immediately revoking all manual control from the physical panels located inside the condominium. I commanded the heavy-duty industrial heating units to engage at their absolute maximum capacity. I overrode the standard residential safety limiters, pushing the target ambient temperature to a blistering 105 degrees. The massive air handlers roared to life on the roof of the building, violently pumping scalding dry air directly into the sealed, climate-controlled environment. I was meticulously recreating the exact atmospheric conditions of the yacht's auxiliary equipment hold. I wanted them to feel the thick, oppressive weight of the air turning into poison. I wanted the sweat to pool rapidly on their skin, and the lack of oxygen to burn their lungs. I monitored the thermal sensors precisely as the internal heat steadily climbed. 90 degrees, 95 degrees, 100 degrees. The physical discomfort would already be waking them from their deep, exhausted sleep, wrapping their minds in a heavy blanket of severe disorientation. The luxury sheets would stick to their sweating bodies. The air would feel impossible to breathe. It was time to shatter their reality entirely. I engaged the comprehensive audiovisual network. I remotely activated the massive 70-inch flat-screen televisions mounted in the master bedroom, the main living space, and the guest suites. I bypassed their standard satellite inputs and commanded every single screen to broadcast pure, blinding white static. The sudden intense artificial light flooded the pitch-black condominium, casting harsh, erratic, rapidly strobing shadows violently across the walls. The sudden visual assault was designed to induce immediate vertigo and panic. Simultaneously, I seized control of the integrated surround sound system. The high-fidelity speakers were embedded directly into the ceiling panels of every single room in the penthouse. I uploaded a specific uncompressed audio file directly to the central server. It was a heavy, relentless United States naval marching cadence. I slammed the digital volume slider to its absolute maximum capacity. The booming sound of hundreds of heavy combat boots slamming violently against asphalt erupted simultaneously through the ceiling speakers. The rhythmic, concussive noise vibrated the drywall and rattled the expensive imported glassware in the kitchen. Left, right, left. The commanding, aggressive shout of a military drill instructor echoed through the sweltering penthouse with deafening force. The sheer acoustic volume was physically painful, transforming their quiet sanctuary into an inescapable echo chamber of hostility. The sensory overload was immediate and catastrophic. Through the system's activated internal security microphones, I heard the precise intended result of my offensive strike. Meredith woke up screaming. It was not a calculated cry of frustration. It was a raw, visceral shriek of absolute, unfiltered terror. Her carefully constructed facade of icy pragmatism shattered instantly under the violent assault of blinding light, deafening noise, and suffocating heat. She thrashed wildly against the expensive silk sheets, entirely disoriented, completely unable to process the sudden transformation of her luxurious environment into a terrifying hostile war zone. Her ruthless pragmatism evaporated in the face of sheer, inexplicable chaos. Cameron scrambled desperately out of the bed, choking heavily on the 105-degree air. His heart hammered furiously against his ribs as he stumbled blindly through the flashing, strobing static. He covered his ears against the booming naval cadence rushing toward the digital thermostat mounted near the heavy bedroom door. He slammed his hands against the interface, desperately swiping at the touchscreen to kill the blazing heat. The digital panel remained completely black, displaying only a tiny glowing red padlock icon. It was utterly unresponsive to his frantic inputs. The system was entirely locked out. He sprinted recklessly toward the main living room, his bare feet slipping on the polished hardwood floor. He grabbed the primary television remote from the coffee table and smashed the power button repeatedly with trembling, sweat-slicked thumbs. The white static continued to burn his retinas. The television refused to shut down. The marching boots continued to stomp relentlessly into his skull, vibrating the floorboards beneath him. He grabbed the heavy power cord and attempted to yank it directly from the wall socket, but the screens were professionally hardwired behind custom cabinetry. He was entirely trapped in a blistering, deafening environment he no longer controlled. Meredith stumbled into the hallway, her face flushed red from the intense heat and pure panic. She grabbed Cameron by the shoulders, shouting frantically over the blaring sound of the military cadence demanding he fix the situation. Cameron could only shake his head, his eyes wide with absolute helpless terror. He possessed zero technical ability to combat the digital siege. The psychological dismantling was functioning with absolute flawless perfection. They were currently drowning in the exact same suffocating panic they had designed for me. I leaned closer to the encrypted laptop in Oliver's office and executed the final, devastating protocol of the night. I accessed an untraceable, heavily encrypted SMS gateway. I typed a single, highly specific sentence and routed it directly to Meredith's personal cellular device. Amidst the sweltering heat, the blinding white static, and the deafening roar of the naval cadence, Meredith's phone vibrated violently against the marble nightstand in the master bedroom. The screen illuminated brightly in the dark, sweaty room. Meredith broke away from Cameron and scrambled back toward the bed. She reached out with a trembling, slick hand and snatched the device from the marble surface. Her wide, terrified eyes scanned the incoming text message originating from an entirely unknown sender. "A steel box gets very hot in the sun, doesn't it, Meredith?" The horrific realization struck her with the devastating force of a physical blow. The color drained entirely from her flushed face, leaving her a sickly, pale white. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. The forged death certificate resting in her designer purse was absolutely worthless. The ghost they had purchased was a lie. The man they had attempted to murder was not rotting at the bottom of the ocean. He was fully alive, he possessed complete operational control of their lives, and he was currently hunting them from the shadows. The mobile device bounced twice on the polished hardwood floor, its glowing screen casting a sickly illumination across the darkness. Meredith stared down at the shattered glass casing, as if a venomous snake had just coiled itself near her bare feet. The relentless, deafening rhythm of the naval marching cadence continued to pound through the ceiling speakers, vibrating the floorboards and amplifying the raw terror seizing her chest. The stifling 105-degree heat of the master bedroom suddenly felt less like a mechanical malfunction and entirely like a perfectly engineered simulation of hell. She slowly raised her head to look at her husband. Cameron was still frantically pressing the power buttons on the television remote, his face twisted in a pathetic mask of absolute incompetence. He was a weak, privileged man who had thought he could effortlessly play the role of a ruthless predator. He had failed spectacularly. Garrison Cole was not rotting at the bottom of the mangrove swamp. He was alive, he was watching them, and he possessed the tactical mastery to turn their luxurious penthouse into a psychological torture chamber. Meredith crossed the sweltering room in 3 rapid, aggressive strides. She slapped the plastic remote directly out of Cameron's sweating hands. It shattered against the far wall, raining cheap plastic shrapnel across the designer rug. Cameron flinched violently, raising his arms in a cowardly defensive posture. He looked at his wife with wide, bloodshot eyes, completely incapable of processing the severity of their situation. Meredith did not offer comfort. She offered absolute venomous fury. She grabbed him by the collar of his silk pajama shirt, pulling his face inches from hers. The blinding white static from the television screens illuminated the pure hatred burning in her eyes. "He is alive!" Meredith screamed, her voice tearing through the oppressive heat and the blaring military audio. "Your father is alive. He sent a message directly to my personal phone. He knows everything. He is controlling the network. He locked the accounts. You told me the auxiliary hold was inescapable. You told me you engaged the magnetic seal and disabled the interior release mechanism. You swore to me that the problem was permanently solved. You failed to kill an old man in a sealed box, and now he is hunting us." Cameron shook his head in frantic, absolute denial. He backed away from her, his breathing rapid and shallow, bordering on severe hyperventilation. The dense, scorching air burned his throat with every panicked intake of oxygen. "That is impossible," Cameron stammered, gripping the edge of the heavy mahogany dresser to keep his legs from buckling. "I checked the heavy aluminum door myself. I watched the lock engage. Nobody survives in that heat without ventilation. It has to be the federal authorities. The Coast Guard or the police must have found the yacht and breached my banking network. They are running a psychological operation to force a confession." Meredith looked at him with profound, unadulterated disgust. "The police do not hack smart home networks to broadcast naval cadences and send cryptic text messages about baking in the sun. This is a targeted personal siege. He is methodically stripping away our resources and our sanity. The syndicate enforcers are heavily armed and waiting outside our lobby, and your father is actively suffocating us from the inside. We have absolutely no money, no leverage, and no escape route." The alliance forged in greed began to fracture instantly under the crushing pressure of imminent destruction. Meredith realized immediately that Cameron was a sinking ship. She refused to drown with him. Her survival instinct demanded immediate liquid capital to facilitate a solitary extraction from the city. If the primary checking accounts were frozen and the credit cards were violently declined by the merchants, she needed untraceable assets immediately. She turned away from her trembling husband and marched directly into his private dressing room. Hidden behind a heavy custom-built mirror was a flush-mounted steel wall safe. It contained the last remaining vestige of her independent wealth. Years before she met Cameron, she had inherited a substantial collection of flawless antique diamond jewelry from her late grandmother. The heirloom pieces were entirely off the books, undocumented by their current insurance providers, and easily worth $100,000 on the black market. It was her absolute last resort, her designated emergency fund. She bypassed Cameron entirely, punching her memorized 6-digit override code into the digital keypad. The heavy steel locking bolts retracted with a solid mechanical clank. She pulled the reinforced door open, expecting to see the familiar velvet display boxes neatly stacked inside the dark compartment. The velvet boxes were gone. The steel shelves were completely empty, save for a single crumpled piece of yellow carbon paper resting at the very bottom. Meredith reached into the dark void, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled the thin paper out into the flashing light of the bedroom. It was a standardized receipt from a high-end discreet pawnbroker located in the jewelry district of downtown Miami. The date stamped on the top corner was exactly 4 weeks ago. The itemized list detailed every single piece of her grandmother's antique diamond collection. The total cash payout was $95,000. Cameron had secretly emptied the safe. He had stolen her most valuable family heirlooms and liquidated them behind her back to secure the initial cash down payment for the luxury yacht. The yacht that was supposed to serve as the perfect, untraceable murder weapon. The yacht that was now heavily defaulted, currently floating empty and entirely useless. He had robbed her to build a trap that ultimately caught nothing. Meredith walked slowly back into the master bedroom. The heat was now physically suffocating, the ambient temperature easily cresting 108 degrees. Cameron was sitting on the edge of the mattress, his head buried deep in his hands, completely broken. Meredith did not yell. The time for screaming had officially passed. She walked directly up to him and slapped the yellow pawnshop receipt sharply against his wet cheek. Cameron flinched, looking down at the crumpled paper. His eyes widened in absolute terrified recognition. He tried to stand, opening his mouth to formulate a pathetic excuse, but Meredith struck him across the face with a closed fist. The heavy blow snapped his head violently to the side, splitting his lip against his teeth. "You stole my grandmother's diamonds to buy the boat," Meredith stated, her voice a deadly, venomous whisper that cut through the blaring, marching cadence. "You liquidated my only escape route to finance your catastrophic failure. You are completely useless. You are heavily indebted to murderers, you are actively hunted by your own father, and you have officially stolen from the only person left on earth willing to tolerate your existence." Meredith did not wait for his bloodied, stammering apology. She turned on her heel and marched directly out of the sweltering master suite, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. She moved swiftly down the heated corridor toward the secondary guest bedroom. She pulled an expensive leather duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet and began throwing functional, unbranded clothing inside. She needed to sever herself entirely from the sinking weight of Cameron Cole. She pulled her secondary, unregistered burner phone from the hidden lining of her purse. She bypassed the standard contacts and manually dialed a specific, highly confidential number. She was calling Marcus Sterling, a notoriously aggressive rival defense attorney who specialized in securing immunity deals for high-profile white-collar criminals facing federal indictment. She listened to the line ring twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. Meredith spoke with cold, calculated precision. She was actively preparing to offer the federal authorities the entire unvarnished truth regarding the forged life insurance policy, the purchased death certificate, and the premeditated murder plot. She was offering Cameron on a silver platter, provided the district attorney granted her absolute immunity as a coerced victim and secured her a negotiated, untraceable portion of the estate payout. She was methodically preparing to feed her husband to the wolves before the syndicate arrived to slaughter them both. The heavy oak door of the master suite slammed shut, vibrating the walls and sealing Cameron Cole in his own personal inferno. Meredith was gone. She had packed her bag, secured her burner phone, and abandoned him to the absolute ruin he had engineered. The naval marching cadence continued to blare relentlessly from the ceiling speakers, a concussive rhythm that synchronized perfectly with his pounding heartbeat. The ambient temperature in the penthouse had crossed 110 degrees. His silk pajamas clung to his skin, completely saturated with fear and sweat. He was entirely isolated. The syndicate enforcers waiting on the street below were not going to accept his excuses, and his ruthless wife was currently plotting to hand him over to the federal authorities. He had exactly one option remaining. He had to execute the final phase of the plan alone. Cameron scrambled across the scorching hardwood floor and snatched Meredith's discarded designer purse. He ripped the lining apart, his frantic fingers searching blindly until he felt the crisp edges of the forged county paper. He pulled out the fabricated medical history and the certified death certificate. These two fraudulent documents represented his singular lifeline. They were the keys to a $5 million kingdom. He did not care about the federal wire fraud implications or the immense legal risk Elias Thorne had warned them about. Desperation completely annihilated his standard caution. He shoved the forged paperwork into his jacket pocket, ignored the blistering heat of his apartment, and bolted toward the private elevator. He bypassed the main lobby entirely, taking the service elevator directly to the subterranean parking garage. He needed to avoid the tinted SUV idling outside the front entrance. He threw himself into his luxury sports car, a vehicle completely financed by his father's stolen capital, and tore out of the concrete structure. He drove with reckless, erratic aggression through the congested morning traffic of downtown Miami. His destination was the Miami-Dade County Probate Court. He needed emergency unilateral control over Garrison's financial assets, and he needed it before the bank closed for the weekend. Cameron parked his vehicle illegally in a reserved judicial loading zone. He sprinted up the wide marble steps of the courthouse, ignoring the shouts of the security personnel. He presented a chaotic, deeply disturbed image. His face was visibly bruised from Meredith's strike. His expensive linen suit was wrinkled, stained with salt water from the yacht, and reeked of stale sweat. He completely bypassed the winding line of citizens waiting patiently at the intake counter. He slammed his hands down on the polished wood of the primary clerk's desk, startling the elderly woman seated behind the protective glass barrier. "I need an emergency judicial hearing immediately." Cameron demanded, his voice cracking with manufactured grief and genuine terror. "My father was lost at sea yesterday afternoon. The Coast Guard is actively conducting a massive search and rescue operation, but my personal accounts have been frozen due to a banking error. I urgently require a temporary conservatorship over his estate to privately fund additional maritime recovery helicopters. Every single minute counts." The clerk blinked, entirely taken aback by his aggressive, disheveled presentation. She adjusted her glasses and reached for a stack of intake forms. "Sir, you need to take a number and wait for your turn. The probate docket is completely full today. An emergency hearing requires an expedited filing fee and a minimum 48-hour processing window." Cameron did not possess 48 hours. He possessed less than 10. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the forged, certified death certificate. He shoved the document violently under the gap in the safety glass. "He is legally dead," Cameron stated, pitching his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the armed bailiffs standing near the metal detectors. "I possess the certified medical documentation from the county examiner. I am his only surviving blood relative. I am the sole heir to his entire estate. I need immediate liquid access to his primary checking accounts to coordinate his recovery and manage his immediate post-mortem affairs. Call a judge right now, or I will hold this entire county personally liable for obstructing a rescue operation." The sheer audacity of his demand, coupled with the official county seal gleaming on the forged document, forced the clerk into action. She picked up the death certificate, her eyes scanning the fabricated signatures and the official digital tracking numbers Elias Thorne had meticulously generated. The document looked entirely authentic. She picked up her heavy desk phone and dialed the internal extension for the presiding probate judge. 30 agonizing minutes later, Cameron was escorted into the austere wood-paneled chambers of Judge Arthur Miller. The judge was a stern, uncompromising veteran of the Florida legal system. He sat behind an imposing elevated desk, peering down at the frantic, bruised man standing before him. The forged death certificate and the fabricated medical history rested squarely in the center of his leather blotter. "Mr. Cole." Judge Miller began, his tone remarkably flat and bureaucratic. This court extends its deepest condolences regarding your father's tragic accident. I have reviewed the official Coast Guard incident report and the medical documentation you provided. The rapid onset of dementia is a terrible affliction. However, your request for an emergency release of estate funds is highly irregular. It is a matter of life and death, Your Honor. Cameron lied smoothly, leaning heavily against the wooden defendant's table. The Coast Guard resources are stretched incredibly thin. I need to hire private salvage divers and aerial surveillance teams immediately. My father's primary checking and savings accounts contain the exact liquid capital required to execute this operation. I simply need your signature to unfreeze those specific assets. Judge Miller picked up his reading glasses and turned his attention to his dual-screen computer monitor. He accessed the secure county probate database, his fingers typing Cameron's provided information. Cameron held his breath, feeling a cold bead of sweat roll slowly down his spine. If the judge authorized the release, Cameron could walk directly across the street to the bank, extract the $800,000, pay off the syndicate, and disappear before Meredith finalized her immunity deal. The judge stopped typing. A sharp, distinct electronic chime echoed loudly in the quiet chamber. The sound was not a confirmation. It was a severe system-level denial alert. Judge Miller frowned, leaning closer to his monitor. He clicked his mouse twice, attempting to bypass the digital roadblock. The system flatly refused his judicial override. He looked back up at Cameron, his expression shifting from mild sympathy to rigid, absolute suspicion. "Mr. Cole," the judge stated coldly, "are you entirely aware of how your father structured his financial holdings?" Cameron swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. "My father was a simple maritime engineer. He maintained standard banking accounts. I have managed his minor financial affairs for years." "That is demonstrably false," Judge Miller countered, turning the monitor slightly so Cameron could see the glowing red lock icon dominating the screen. "Your father did not maintain standard accounts. Garrison Cole's entire financial portfolio, including his liquid assets, property deeds, and primary trust funds, was completely restructured 5 years ago. His entire estate is permanently locked inside a blind, irrevocable trust." Cameron felt the floor drop entirely out from underneath his feet. A blind trust. That makes absolutely no sense. He never mentioned a trust. I am his son. I am his designated next of kin. Blood relation is entirely irrelevant in this specific legal context, Judge Miller explained, his voice hardening into a stern reprimand. A blind, irrevocable trust removes all ownership and control from the individual and places it entirely in the hands of a designated independent executor. Even with a certified death certificate, this court possesses absolutely zero jurisdictional authority to breach that trust or release a single dime of those funds. The protective covenants hardwired into this estate are ironclad. Any unilateral attempt by this court to force a withdrawal would instantly trigger a federal fraud alert. Cameron gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning pure white. His breathing grew jagged. He had murdered his father, purchased a ghost, and walked directly into a federal building, only to discover that the money he had killed for was locked inside an impenetrable legal fortress. Then how do I access the funds? Cameron demanded, abandoning his grieving son routine entirely. There has to be a mechanism. The money belongs to me. The money belongs strictly to the trust, Judge Miller corrected sharply. The only individual on this earth who possesses the legal authority to authorize an emergency disbursement is the primary executor of that trust. The system mandates that you must secure his physical notarized signature on a formal release petition. Without his explicit consent, you will not receive a single penny. Cameron felt a crushing wave of absolute defeat wash over his trembling body. Who is the executor? Judge Miller adjusted his glasses, reading the heavily encrypted file data. The primary executor and sole legal custodian of Garrison Cole's estate is a private corporate litigator located in the financial district. His name is Oliver Hayes. The name struck Cameron like a physical blow to the sternum. He knew exactly who Oliver Hayes was. Hayes was not a simple, agreeable family lawyer. He was a ruthless, highly lethal apex predator in the Miami legal arena, a man who possessed a legendary reputation for systematically destroying his opponents. He was also Garrison Cole's oldest, most trusted, and most fiercely loyal military ally. Cameron stared blindly at the judge, the absolute horror of his situation, finally locking into perfect, inescapable focus. He could not run. He could not hide. To survive the syndicate enforcers waiting outside his home, he had to secure a signature. He had to walk directly into the office of the most dangerous lawyer in Florida and attempt to con the man who had helped build his father's impenetrable trap. The invisible snare had snapped violently shut around his throat. Cameron left the courthouse in a state of absolute blinding panic. He drove his sports car directly into the heart of the financial district, recklessly abandoning the expensive vehicle in a commercial loading zone directly outside the towering glass skyscraper that housed Oliver Hayes and Associates. From my secure position inside the firm's dedicated surveillance suite 2 floors above Oliver's primary office, I watched my son step out of the polished steel elevator. He looked exactly like a hunted animal. The pristine clinical environment of the Apex law firm contrasted sharply with his ruined physical state. His expensive linen suit was heavily wrinkled, stained with dried salt water from the yacht, and reeked of stale sweat. A dark, aggressive purple bruise was already rapidly forming across his cheekbone from Meredith's violent strike. He marched past the marble reception desk, completely ignoring the protests of the administrative staff, and pushed his way straight toward the heavy soundproofed mahogany doors of Oliver's private sanctuary. Oliver sat perfectly still behind his expansive desk. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and absolute unyielding discipline. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his posture perfectly rigid, projecting an aura of immense quiet power. He did not flinch or react when Cameron burst violently through the heavy doors. He simply folded his hands neatly over a pristine yellow legal pad and waited patiently for the performance to begin. Cameron threw himself heavily into one of the expensive leather guest chairs positioned across from the desk. He immediately buried his bruised face in his hands, forcing his shoulders to heave in a rhythmic, entirely manufactured display of profound grief. He squeezed his eyes shut tightly, actively forcing moisture to pool along his lower lashes. It was a pathetic, deeply amateurish display of sorrow, lacking any genuine human emotion. He was arrogantly attempting to manipulate a veteran corporate litigator who had built a highly lucrative career out of cross-examining and destroying professional liars. "He is gone." Cameron choked out, his voice trembling with artificial agony. "My father is gone, Oliver. The Coast Guard officially called off the primary search grid this morning. They told me there was absolutely no chance of survival in those deep water currents. The county medical examiner just issued the official documentation." Cameron reached into his ruined jacket pocket. He pulled out the forged, highly illegal death certificate he had purchased from Elias Thorne and shoved it aggressively across the polished wood of the desk. "I need you to authorize the immediate release of the primary estate funds," Cameron pleaded, wiping a fake tear from his bruised cheek. "We desperately need to hire private maritime recovery units and deep water salvage teams. I am not leaving him out there in the dark. I need to bring him home." Oliver did not reach for the paper immediately. He let the forged document sit on the desk deliberately, allowing the silence in the large room to stretch until it became physically suffocating. The extended silence was a calculated interrogation tactic. It naturally forced the liar to fill the uncomfortable void. Cameron shifted nervously in the leather chair, his eyes darting frantically around the expansive office, actively avoiding Oliver's piercing, analytical gaze. Finally, Oliver reached out and picked up the document. He produced a pair of thin silver reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his face. He read every single line of the forged certificate with agonizing, deliberate slowness. He examined the stolen county seals, the fabricated digital tracking numbers, and the forged signature of the compromised medical examiner. He knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that the paper was a complete criminal fabrication. We had watched the disgraced doctor print it in that decaying motel room just a few hours ago, but Oliver played his assigned role flawlessly. "This is a profoundly tragic development," Cameron Oliver stated, his voice completely devoid of warmth or sympathy. I have known Garrison for over 30 years. He was a brilliant engineer and a fiercely loyal friend. The world is a much darker place without his presence. From a purely legal standpoint, this document satisfies the necessary bureaucratic requirements. The county has officially declared him deceased. The state of Florida officially recognizes the termination of his life. Cameron released a heavy, shuddering breath, slouching back into the leather chair. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed the forged ghost was finally working its magic. He leaned forward, dropping the morning sun routine entirely, his posture instantly replaced by raw, urgent greed. "Then unlock the accounts right now," Oliver Cameron demanded, his voice hardening. The probate judge stated clearly that you hold the sole authority as the primary executor of his estate. I need an emergency wire transfer of $800,000 routed directly to my personal offshore account immediately. The private recovery teams require liquid cash up front before they deploy the helicopters. Do it right now. Oliver slowly removed his silver reading glasses and placed them deliberately on top of the forged death certificate. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, steepling his fingers together. I am afraid you are operating under a catastrophic misunderstanding of your father's financial reality, Oliver explained smoothly, his eyes locking onto Cameron like a predator locking onto its prey. You are entirely correct that I am the sole executor of his estate. You are correct that I possess the exclusive legal authority to disperse his assets. However, you are entirely incorrect regarding the ultimate destination of those funds. Cameron froze. The remaining color drained completely from his flushed face, leaving him a sickly pale white. What are you talking about? I am his only child. I am the sole biological heir to his legacy. The money belongs to me. Your biological status is entirely irrelevant. Oliver countered, his tone hardening into a lethal weapon. 6 months ago, your father ordered a comprehensive, highly classified forensic audit of his personal and corporate accounts. He discovered massive, systematic financial irregularities. He discovered that you had been actively embezzling millions of dollars from his holding companies to secretly finance your luxury condominium, your designer lifestyle, and your recently purchased yacht. He realized with absolute clarity that you were not a son, but a dangerous, entitled parasite. Cameron opened his mouth to protest a lie already forming on his lips, but Oliver raised a single hand, silencing him instantly with a gesture of absolute authority. Following the immediate results of that audit, Garrison directed me to aggressively restructure his entire financial portfolio. Oliver continued relentlessly. We rapidly liquidated his commercial real estate holdings. We consolidated his corporate dividends. We moved every single liquid asset, every high-yield investment account, and his $5 million life insurance policy into a completely blind, irrevocable trust. By federal legal definition, an irrevocable trust cannot be modified, accessed, or broken by any external party, including a probate judge or a biological heir. I am his son, Cameron repeated blindly, the absolute panic rising in his chest like a tidal wave. He had to leave a statutory provision for me. It is the law. You cannot simply erase me from the records. The law dictates that a man may leave his accumulated wealth to whoever he chooses, Oliver stated coldly, leaning forward to deliver the final crushing blow. When we drafted the final binding covenants of the trust, Garrison was exceptionally clear regarding his wishes. He legally and permanently disinherited you. He removed your name from every single legal document associated with his estate. The trust contains a strict, unbreakable single beneficiary clause. Oliver paused deliberately, letting the absolute finality of the moment settle heavily over the quiet room. In the event of his verified death, the entirety of his wealth, including the $5 million insurance payout you just attempted to claim using a forged county document, is immediately and irrevocably transferred to the Navy Veterans Foundation. You get absolutely nothing, Cameron, not a single dime. The sheer catastrophic magnitude of the revelation hit Cameron with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. The $800,000 he desperately owed to the violent syndicate enforcers was entirely gone. The $5 million he had committed a brutal patricide to secure was permanently out of reach. He had slaughtered his own father and destroyed his entire life for a treasure chest that was already completely empty. The overwhelming, suffocating pressure of his imminent violent demise snapped the last remaining threads of his fragile sanity. The fake tears dried instantly on his bruised cheeks, his face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He leaped violently out of the leather guest chair, lunging forward and slamming both of his fists aggressively against Oliver's mahogany desk. The heavy impact rattled the silver picture frames. "You are lying!" Cameron screamed at the top of his lungs, spit flying aggressively from his trembling lips. "You stole the money. You manipulated a sick old man into signing away his rightful fortune so you could pocket the massive administration fees. I will drag you through every single court in this state. I will expose your corrupt, pathetic firm to the media. I will have you disbarred, thrown into a federal prison, and completely ruined." Oliver did not move a single muscle. He did not flinch away from the screaming man leaning over his desk. He simply stared up at Cameron with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a highly predictable dying insect. His absolute lack of physical fear only fueled Cameron's blinding, desperate fury. "I am not leaving this office without my money!" Cameron roared, his voice echoing loudly through the soundproofed walls, completely shattering the quiet dignity of the law firm. "I will burn this entire building to the absolute ground. I will hunt you down and destroy your life. The syndicate is going to kill me if I do not pay them by Friday. You give me the access codes to that trust right now, or I swear to God I will rip them out of your throat." Cameron was completely consumed by his own violent, uncontrollable tantrum. He paced aggressively back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, hurling legally actionable threats, openly admitting to his desperate financial ruin, and explicitly confirming his willingness to commit further acts of extreme violence. He was entirely focused on intimidating the stoic lawyer sitting calmly behind the desk. He was a desperate, drowning man lashing out blindly at the only solid object remaining in the room. Because of his blind, singular focus on Oliver's destruction, Cameron entirely failed to monitor his surrounding environment. He failed to inspect the perimeter of the meticulously organized office. He failed to look up at the top shelf of the expansive legal library, positioned directly over Oliver's right shoulder. If he had stopped screaming for a single second, if he had possessed even a fraction of the tactical situational awareness he arrogantly claimed to have, he would have seen it immediately. Resting discreetly between two thick leather-bound volumes of maritime case law was a small black high-definition recording device. A tiny, brilliant red light blinked rhythmically in the dark shadows of the bookshelf, flawlessly capturing every single word, every violent physical threat, and every desperate, highly illegal admission Cameron Cole willingly threw into the room. The morning salt air hung heavy and humid over the marina, thick with the scent of brine and diesel fuel. Cameron adjusted his sunglasses, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled his sedan into a slip near the end of the main pier. Beside him, Meredith sat with her jaw set, her eyes scanning the horizon with a cold, predatory intensity. They had slept only 3 hours, their nerves frayed to the breaking point by the events of the previous night. The forged death certificate sat in Meredith's handbag, a crisp, terrifying document that now represented their only path to solvency. They were here for the yacht, the gleaming multi-million-dollar monument to Cameron's failed ambition. If they could reach the private buyer waiting at the slip, the secret sale would provide them the capital to vanish before the syndicate or the federal authorities closed the distance. They stepped out of the vehicle and began to walk briskly down the long wooden pier. Cameron adjusted his collar, trying to project the confidence of a successful heir, but his footsteps were uneven. He reached into his pocket and fingered the keys to the vessel, his mind racing through the logistics of the private transfer. He imagined the feeling of the wire transfer hitting his account, the heavy weight of the cash, allowing them to finally shed the suffocating skin of their current reality. Meredith walked a step ahead, her heels clicking sharply against the planks. She was already mentally calculating the next move, her focus entirely locked on the empty berth where the yacht should have been docked. They stopped simultaneously. The silence of the marina was absolute, interrupted only by the distant rhythmic slapping of waves against the pylons. The berth was vacant. A massive industrial-grade towboat, its hull painted with the stark insignia of a national maritime lender, was churning the dark harbor water 50 yards away. The yacht, stripped of its flags and identification markers, was lashed securely to the towboat's stern. Two more heavy-duty towing vessels were circling the area, their engines humming with aggressive power. Cameron felt the breath vanish from his lungs. He stumbled toward the edge of the pier, his hand shielding his eyes from the glare of the morning sun. The yacht was already moving toward the mouth of the harbor, hauled away like a common piece of salvaged junk. On the dock, standing directly in front of their intended meeting point, were three men dressed in sharp navy blue suits, flanked by two uniformed police officers. They held clipboards and official-looking document cases. The lead official stood with his hands on his hips, watching the yacht fade into the horizon. Cameron sprinted forward, his face flushed with panicked rage. "You have no right to touch that vessel," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "That yacht is private property. It is under active probate management following the unfortunate death of its owner." The bank official turned slowly, his expression one of bored administrative indifference. He tapped his clipboard, holding up a thick stack of legal notices. "Mr. Cole, I presume. You are exactly the person we needed to speak with. This vessel is not under probate. This vessel is the subject of a massive court-ordered asset seizure protocol. The maritime mortgage on this yacht has been in total default for 60 days, and our investigation has uncovered evidence of fraudulent documentation submitted during the original loan application process. We are acting under the explicit authority of the Regional Federal Court." Cameron felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked toward the police officers, his hands raised in a pathetic defensive gesture. "My father is dead. The estate is currently under legal review. You cannot seize assets that are tied to a missing person investigation." The lead officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the utility belt near his sidearm. "Mr. Cole, we are aware of the missing person status regarding Garrison Cole. We are also aware of the suspicious nature of the loan applications tied to this yacht. We have received verified reports of organized insurance fraud and illicit asset manipulation. The vessel has been reclaimed by the lender, and any further attempt to interfere with this seizure will result in your immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. You are currently under investigation. I strongly suggest you vacate this dock before we find a reason to handcuff you right here in front of everyone." A small crowd of dock workers and boat owners had begun to gather, their faces twisted with curiosity and judgment. They watched the spectacle in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Cameron felt their gazes like needles piercing his skin. He was a disgraced heir, a bankrupt fraud, and now a public laughingstock. He looked back toward the open harbor, watching the only thing he had left disappear into the shimmering haze. His legs buckled, and he nearly collapsed onto the wooden pier. He was completely stripped. His assets were gone, his reputation was disintegrating in real time, and his time had officially expired. Meredith did not offer a word of comfort. Her face was a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. She saw the police moving closer, their hands hovering near their belts. She didn't scream and she didn't cry. She simply grabbed Cameron's bicep with a grip like steel and wrenched him backward toward the parking lot. She pushed him into the driver's seat of their sedan, her movements frantic and violent. She slammed the door shut and leaned across the center console, her eyes wide with a manic, singular focus. "The yacht is gone," she hissed, her voice vibrating with restrained, white-hot fury. "We have no boat. We have no money. We have no time to negotiate with these pathetic local officials. The syndicate is going to find us within hours, and the federal agents are already tagging us for the mortgage fraud. We do not have another day to play these games." Cameron stared at the dashboard, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't find the ignition button. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, his bravado entirely shattered. "The insurance policy. Thorne's forged death certificate. It's all we have. If we go to the insurance company headquarters now, they might still process the claim before the federal fraud alerts reach their internal system." Meredith grabbed the steering wheel, forcing him to look at her. "Then we drive. We do not stop for traffic. We do not stop for sirens. And we do not stop for anyone. We go straight to the insurance company headquarters." We present the forged documents, we demand the $5 million wire transfer, and we force them to release the funds before the authorities can stop us. It is our final absolute act of survival. If we get the money, we disappear to the islands. If we fail, we are dead. There is no middle ground anymore. Cameron finally pressed the ignition button, the engine roaring to life with an aggressive, throaty growl. He shifted into reverse, spinning the tires against the asphalt with a sharp, piercing screech. He pulled out of the marina with enough speed to cause the sedan to sway dangerously on its suspension. He merged into the heavy Miami traffic, driving with a total disregard for the laws of the road. Meredith stared forward, her purse clutched so tightly to her chest that her knuckles were white. She watched the rearview mirror, constantly waiting for the flashing lights of an unmarked police car to appear. The city blurred past the windows, a hazy, chaotic collection of glass towers and desperate, sweltering streets. Cameron drove like a madman, weaving through the lanes, cutting off commercial trucks and forcing cars to swerve in his wake. Every erratic movement of the sedan felt like a desperate final gamble against a rigged deck. They were hurtling toward the insurance conglomerate headquarters, a massive monolithic black tower that rose out of the downtown skyline. It was the epicenter of the trap they had spent their entire lives constructing. Cameron looked at the speedometer, then back at the road, his pulse echoing in his ears. He was a fugitive, a thief and a murderer driving blindly toward the very institution that was designed to catch him. He knew the building's layout. He knew the specific department head who handled high-value death claims. He had everything mapped out in his fevered mind, but he had no backup, no safety, and absolutely no way to avoid the crushing reality of what awaited them. They were crossing the federal line, entering the final, inevitable endgame of their own making, and the air inside the car felt as thin and depleted as their last remaining shred of hope. The sheer magnitude of the black tower loomed over them, a monolithic testament to corporate indifference. Cameron and Meredith navigated the polished marble lobby, their steps echoing with the hollow sound of impending finality. They looked like desperate ghosts trapped in designer suits, their faces tight with the crushing weight of their mutual destruction. Cameron clutched the forged death certificate inside his inner breast pocket as if it were a holy relic, while Meredith marched toward the elevator with the terrifying singular purpose of a woman who had already sold her soul for a chance at a clean exit. They ascended to the 35th floor, the air inside the elevator cabin thick with the unspoken, jagged tension of their crumbling alliance. They did not speak. They did not touch. They were two enemies temporarily united by a common desperate need for blood money. They reached the corporate suite of the regional claims director, a glass-walled enclosure that offered a panoramic, sickening view of the sprawling city below. The claims director, a man named Henderson, stood to greet them. He was draped in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Cameron had left in his secondary unmonitored savings account. His expression was one of practiced synthetic empathy, the exact brand of professional kindness designed to disarm the grieving before they realized they were being slaughtered by policy fine print. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole, please take a seat," Henderson said, gesturing toward the heavy polished mahogany table that dominated the center of the room. "I have reviewed the entirety of the documentation provided by the medical examiner's office. It is a profoundly tragic case. Your father's rapid decline was a cruel twist of fate." Cameron sank into the plush leather chair, his hands clasped together to hide their violent tremor. He pushed the forged documents across the gleaming surface of the table. Every fiber of his being was screaming for him to turn around and run, to disappear into the anonymity of the city, but the vision of the syndicate enforcers waiting outside his home held him in a rigid, icy grip. It was unavoidable. Cameron said, his voice a perfectly rehearsed tremor of grief. He spent his final months in total confusion, completely detached from the world. The drowning was merely the final, merciful release from his agony. Meredith sat beside him, her gaze fixed on Henderson with a predatory focus. She was the anchor of the performance, her eyes wide and wet with synthetic sorrow. She was the one who had kept the narrative flowing, the one who had ensured that no logistical detail of their fabricated history remained unpolished. Henderson meticulously reviewed the documents. He checked the official county seals against his database. He verified the digital signatures with a mechanical, disinterested efficiency. He was a man who saw death strictly as a mathematical liability, a series of boxes that needed to be checked to clear the ledger. Everything appears to be in order, Henderson finally declared, leaning back in his chair. The medical history supports the claim, and the official death certificate meets all federal requirements for an accelerated payout. Given the circumstances and the clear documented nature of the accident, the firm has decided to expedite the entire death benefit. It is a gesture of sympathy for the family. He reached into a leather portfolio, pulled out a thick, high-quality document, and a single heavy black fountain pen. He slid the release form and a pre-printed $5 million cashier's check across the mahogany. The sunlight hit the check, turning the gold lettering into a brilliant, blinding beacon of their salvation. Cameron stared at the check. The sight of it felt like a physical blow to his solar plexus. $5 million. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life, a sum that promised total immunity from his sins. He saw the potential for a new life, a new identity, a complete erasure of the man he had become. His greed roared in his ears, drowning out the lingering, frantic warnings of his own conscience. He reached for the pen. His fingers felt heavy, detached from his body. He looked at Meredith, who gave a nearly imperceptible sharp nod. The authorization was clear. He placed the tip of the fountain pen against the line on the release document. With a single sharp stroke, he signed his name, Cameron Cole. As the ink began to settle into the textured paper, the heavy, soundproofed glass door behind them clicked with a sharp metallic sound. It was the distinct noise of an electronic lock engaging from the exterior, a sound that transformed the conference room into an airtight, inescapable vault. Cameron froze, the pen still hovering over the document. The air in the room suddenly felt unnaturally still, the corporate hum of the HVAC system cutting out completely. Henderson's face shifted. The synthetic empathy that had defined his demeanor since they entered the office vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic finality. He did not reach for the signed document. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and stepped back toward the wall. "That signature is the only thing we required," Henderson said, his voice now devoid of any pretense of warmth. Cameron stood up, his heart beginning to slam against his ribs. "What is going on? Why did the door lock? I want my check. I want to leave this building immediately." Oliver Hayes stepped out from behind the heavy velvet drapes that had been pulled closed against the morning sun. He was accompanied by two uniformed federal marshals, their hands resting comfortably near their holstered sidearms. He looked at Cameron with the same cold, detached curiosity he had displayed in his office. But this time there was a visible triumphant edge to his expression. "The document you just signed is a legal confession of fraud," Oliver stated, his voice echoing in the small glass-walled room. "You have just officially acknowledged the presentation of forged medical documents and a fabricated death certificate to secure a federal insurance payout. You have effectively served as the primary witness for your own prosecution." Meredith stood up, her face turning a ghastly shade of pale. She looked at the door, then back at the marshals, her composure fracturing under the weight of the realization. "This is a setup," she hissed, her voice rising in panic. "We are victims of coercion. My husband was forced into this by the syndicate. We have evidence of our threats." "The evidence you possess is currently being cataloged by the FBI," Oliver replied, gesturing toward the silent, high-definition camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "We have been monitoring your movements since you left that motel room. We have recorded your negotiations with the document forger. We have logged every wire transfer attempt. We have listened to your violent threats in my office." Cameron felt the ground beneath his feet turn to liquid. He lunged for the check on the table, but the marshals were faster. They crossed the room in 2 strides, pinning him firmly against the mahogany table. He struggled, his face grinding against the polished wood, but he was completely overpowered. "You cannot do this!" Cameron roared, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "You are all part of the fraud. You wanted the insurance money for your foundation." "Your father did not want the money," Oliver said, stepping forward until he was standing inches from Cameron's face. "He wanted the truth." And now, thanks to your monumental greed and your complete inability to control your own impulses, the truth is officially on the record. The lead marshal pulled a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click of the restraints fastening around Cameron's wrists sounded like a final, damning verdict. Meredith stood frozen, her eyes darting between the marshals and the locked glass door. She saw the end. She saw the absolute, irreversible destruction of the life she had desperately clawed to build. She saw the federal penitentiary, the long years of confinement, the total loss of her identity. She collapsed into the chair Cameron had just vacated, her face buried in her hands. The silence that filled the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against them from every side. The $5 million check sat on the table, a useless decorative slip of paper. The forged certificate was now the primary instrument of their demise. They had reached the absolute peak of their ambition, only to find that the mountaintop was the edge of an infinite dark abyss. Cameron watched as Oliver Hayes turned and walked toward the door, his movements fluid, professional, and entirely unbothered. The trap was closed. The predator had caught his prey, and the long, agonizing process of their legal, social, and financial annihilation was finally ready to begin in earnest. The room felt colder now, stripped of its corporate pretense, leaving only the raw, ugly reality of their final defeat. They were truly, utterly alone in the dark. The heavy glass door swung outward, the hydraulic hinges whining softly in the pressurized silence of the conference room. Two federal agents stepped through the threshold. They were large, imposing men wearing severe tactical suits, their postures rigid and their eyes scanning the space with professional, unblinking hostility. They flanked the doorway, creating an impenetrable physical barrier. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Cameron and Meredith sat paralyzed, their breath catching in their throats as the reality of the ambush fully materialized. Then the final impossible figure stepped through the gap between the federal agents. Garrison Cole strode into the center of the executive conference room. He did not look like a man who had spent 2 days baking in the lethal, suffocating heat of an auxiliary engine hold. He did not resemble a tragic victim lost to the ocean depths. He was wearing a sharply tailored, deep navy blue suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders. His posture was impeccably straight, completely devoid of the frailty Cameron had so eagerly anticipated. His silver hair was meticulously groomed, and his eyes, cold and flinty, locked onto his son with the devastating precision of a naval targeting laser. He was fiercely alive, and he radiated an absolute terrifying authority. The heavy fountain pen slipped entirely from Cameron's slick, trembling fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp clatter, rolling over the signed release document. Thick black ink bled rapidly into the pristine white paper, ruining the signature and staining the fabricated death certificate. Cameron stared at the man standing before him, his jaw hanging slack, his mind completely incapable of processing the visual data his eyes were transmitting. His brain misfired desperately, trying to reconcile the physical presence of his father with the absolute certainty of his murder plot. Meredith shrank backward, pressing herself deep into the plush leather chair. Her carefully constructed mask of arrogant superiority dissolved instantly, replaced by a raw, unadulterated terror that stripped away every ounce of her manufactured composure. She had anticipated federal agents. She had anticipated a legal battle over the forged documents. She had never, in her most catastrophic nightmares, anticipated the physical resurrection of the man she had conspired to kill. You are dead." Cameron stammered, his voice a pathetic, reedy whisper that barely carried across the quiet room. "We left you." The door was locked. The heat. Garrison did not acknowledge the stammering question. He did not offer an explanation of his survival or a comforting word. He stepped forward, his leather shoes silent against the thick carpet. He stopped directly across from Cameron, the mahogany table serving as the only physical barrier between them. He reached down and picked up the pristine $5 million cashier's check that Henderson had presented just moments before. He held the thick paper between his fingers, examining the sum with a look of profound disgust. $5 million, Garrison said, his voice deep and resonant, entirely lacking the tremor of a victim. You calculated the exact price of my life, Cameron. You weighed 35 years of fatherhood against the cost of a luxury yacht and decided that my existence was a depreciating asset. He gripped the edges of the check firmly. With a slow, deliberate, and agonizingly precise motion, Garrison tore the heavy paper directly down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper was deafening in the silent room. He dropped the two ruined halves onto the table, letting them flutter down onto the ink-stained forgery. Your arithmetic was fundamentally flawed, Garrison stated coldly. You failed to calculate the cost of failure. Garrison turned his attention to Meredith, who was trembling violently in her chair. You orchestrated this, Meredith. You provided the operational discipline my son so severely lacks. You purchased the forged medical history. You procured the fabricated death certificate from a disgraced pill pusher in a decaying motel room. You believed you could outmaneuver the Federal Registry and the insurance conglomerate with a $10,000 bribe. Meredith opened her mouth to speak, to offer the carefully rehearsed lie of coercion she had planned to deliver to the rival attorney, but the words withered in her throat under Garrison's relentless gaze. I survived the engine hold because I built that vessel. Garrison continued, shifting his focus back to his son. I designed the auxiliary ventilation system. I installed the manual overrides that you, in your profound arrogance and mechanical ignorance, never bothered to investigate. I listened to you lock the door. I felt the ambient temperature rise to 120 degrees. I experienced the physical reality of my own son, attempting to cook me alive in a steel box to service his debts. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, invading Cameron's physical space. I did not report you immediately. A simple arrest for attempted murder was insufficient. A sudden disappearance leaves too many loose ends. I needed you to commit fully to the destruction of your own life. I needed you to cross the federal line. I needed you to exhaust your resources, panic under pressure, and actively engage in a documented, undeniable felony. Garrison motioned to Oliver Hayes, who stepped forward with a thick, heavy manila envelope. Oliver placed the envelope on the table and slid it precisely toward Cameron. It was the complete, undeniable dossier of their destruction. We possess the audio recordings of your negotiations with Elias Thorne Garrison, listed, his voice adopting the sterile, merciless cadence of a military tribunal. We have the high-definition video of the cash handoff. We have the GPS cloning data placing you at the motel. We have the digital logs of your attempt to access my blind trust. We have the internal security footage from your condominium documenting your violent physical altercation and your explicit admission of the murder plot. The weight of the evidence crushed the last remaining fragments of Cameron's defiance. He collapsed forward onto the table, his shoulders heaving with genuine desperate sobs. He had been completely outplayed from the very beginning. The entire sequence of events, the bounced autodraft, the frozen accounts, the crushing heat in the penthouse, had been a meticulously orchestrated psychological siege designed to force this exact fatal mistake. Meredith's survival instinct flared, a final desperate twitch of a dying animal. She lunged out of her chair, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at her husband. "He forced me into this," she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "I didn't know he was going to lock you in that room. He told me it was an accident. He told me the syndicate was going to kill us both if we didn't get the money. He bought the forged documents. He signed the claim. I am a victim of his coercion." Cameron's head snapped up, his bruised face twisted in pure betrayed fury. "You liar!" he roared, spit flying from his lips. "You orchestrated the entire purchase. You sold your grandmother's diamonds to fund the yacht. You told me we needed to finish the job. You packed your bags this morning and called Marcus Sterling to secure an immunity deal. You were going to throw me to the federal prosecutors before the syndicate even arrived." The facade of their affluent, unified marriage shattered completely, exposing the rotting, cannibalistic core of their partnership. They screamed at each other across the mahogany table, hurling accusations, exposing further lies, and desperately trying to shift the blame onto the other. They were drowning, and they were actively trying to stand on each other's heads to catch a single breath of air. Garrison watched them tear each other apart in the center of the corporate conference room. He felt absolutely no pity, no lingering fatherly affection. The men and women who stood before him were not family. They were simply criminals who had finally met their inevitable consequence. He nodded once to the federal agent standing by the door. The agent stepped forward, their movements swift and practiced. The heavy metallic rasp of handcuffs being drawn from utility belts cut through the screaming argument. An agent grabbed Cameron by the shoulder, hauling him roughly to his feet and twisting his arms behind his back. The cold steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists, with a definitive bone-chilling finality. A second agent mirrored the action, with Meredith ignoring her frantic, hysterical pleas for a lawyer. Cameron Cole and Meredith Cole, the lead agent, stated, his voice booming over their protests. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree insurance fraud, wire fraud, and the purchase and utilization of forged federal documents. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you begin using it." They were dragged out of the glass-walled room, their designer clothing rumpled, and their dignity entirely destroyed. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, cutting off their desperate shouts. Garrison stood alone in the quiet conference room with Oliver Hayes. The torn pieces of the $5 million check fluttered slightly in the air conditioning. The trap was empty. The predators were caged. The long, silent war was finally over. 6 agonizing months of federal indictments, meticulously documented discovery phases, and brutal media scrutiny evaporated into the sterile silence of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida. The expansive courtroom was a cavern of polished oak and cold marble. The air conditioning hummed a low mechanical note that seemed to amplify the absolute stillness of the gallery. Every wooden bench was packed to maximum capacity, with local journalists, fascinated onlookers, and legal aides, yet not a single person dared to make a sound. The sheer gravity of the impending judgment commanded total breathless silence. Seated at the heavy defense table, Cameron Cole was utterly unrecognizable from the arrogant, linen-clad heir who had stormed into the insurance conglomerate half a year prior. His expensive manufactured tan had faded into a sickly fluorescent pallor. The tailored suits had been permanently replaced by the shapeless, degrading orange canvas of the federal penal system. His shoulders were slumped forward, his chest caving inward, as if the physical weight of his crimes was actively crushing his spine. His hands lay flat on the defense table, trembling uncontrollably, the heavy iron chains linking his wrists clinking softly against the wood every time he drew a jagged breath. Beside him, separated by a deliberate foot of empty space, sat Meredith, the ruthless, calculating predator who had flawlessly orchestrated the logistical nightmare of the forged documents. Was completely gone. Her hair was limp and entirely devoid of its usual immaculate styling. Her sharp, aristocratic features had hollowed out into a mask of permanent, exhausted terror. They did not look at each other. The fragile, toxic alliance they had built on a foundation of mutual greed had shattered the moment the federal handcuffs clicked shut, replaced immediately by desperate, pathetic attempts to trade each other for a reduced sentence. The federal prosecutors had eagerly accepted their respective confessions, utilizing their mutual betrayals to construct an impenetrable, airtight case against them both. The presiding federal judge, a stern woman with decades of experience dismantling organized fraud, looked down at them from her elevated bench. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes sweeping over the 2 broken figures with profound, unyielding disdain. She arranged the thick stack of sentencing guidelines and leaned forward toward the microphone. "Cameron Cole," she began, her voice resonating sharply through the quiet room. "You conspired to execute your own father. You trapped him in an active engine hold, intending to subject him to a slow, agonizing death by hyperthermia. When you believed you had successfully committed this patricide, you immediately engaged in a coordinated, highly sophisticated campaign of wire fraud, insurance fraud, and the utilization of forged federal documents. Your actions were not driven by desperation or necessity, but by an absolute sociopathic greed. You viewed the man who gave you life as a disposable asset." Cameron squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear cutting a track through the pale dust of his cheek. He had nothing left to say. His expensive defense attorneys had entirely run out of maneuvers. The court sentences you to a mandatory 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge declared her tone, leaving absolutely no room for appeal or negotiation. Cameron released a sharp, choked sob, his head dropping forward until his bruised forehead rested against the cold wood of the table. 25 years. A quarter of a century locked inside a concrete cage. His youth, his freedom, and his entire future were instantly wiped from existence. The luxury penthouses, the imported sports cars, the tailored suits, and the elite social status were completely gone, replaced permanently by cinder-block walls, steel bars, and the brutal regimented schedule of the federal penal system. He was entirely ruined. The judge immediately turned her piercing gaze toward Meredith. Meredith Cole, you were the logistical architect of this horrific enterprise. You procured the fabricated medical documents. You orchestrated the bribery of a compromised medical examiner. You actively facilitated the attempted murder and the subsequent financial manipulation. You are a highly dangerous, calculating individual who viewed human life as a mere obstacle to your financial comfort. The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison. Meredith did not cry. She simply stared straight ahead, her eyes wide and completely vacant, her mind entirely incapable of processing the vast empty void of the next 15 years. The judge raised her heavy wooden gavel. She struck the sounding block with a single deafening crack. The sound echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom, an absolute irreversible punctuation mark on their destruction. The trial was officially concluded. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Cameron and Meredith by their upper arms and hauling them roughly to their feet. They were marched toward the heavy side doors of the holding cells, their iron chains rattling loudly against the marble floor. They did not look back. They simply disappeared into the dark mechanical belly of the justice system, entirely consumed by the trap they had so meticulously built. Garrison Cole sat in the front row of the gallery. He watched them vanish behind the steel doors. He did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. He did not feel the triumphant thrill of revenge. He felt only a profound, settling peace. The cancerous infection that had secretly plagued his life for decades had finally been surgically excised. The rot was gone. He stood up smoothly, buttoning his tailored navy blue suit jacket, and walked calmly down the center aisle of the courtroom. Oliver Hayes fell into step beside him, offering a brief, respectful nod of confirmation. The legal war was over. The assets were completely secured inside the irrevocable trust. The corporate restructuring was flawless. Garrison walked through the heavy double doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the vibrant, blinding light of the Miami morning. The thick, humid air washed over him immediately. It did not feel oppressive. It felt incredibly clean. It tasted of salt ocean wind and absolute freedom. A massive swarm of local and national reporters was waiting at the bottom of the wide marble steps. A chaotic wall of flashing cameras, extending microphones, and shouting journalists surged forward the moment Garrison appeared. They were hungry for a sensational quote, desperate to capture the raw emotional breakdown of a father who had just watched his only son receive a quarter-century prison sentence for attempted murder. The noise was a deafening roar of overlapping questions. Mr. Cole, how do you feel about the verdict? Mr. Cole, did you ever suspect your son was capable of such violence? Garrison, what do you say to the people who blame the pressures of your immense wealth for your son's actions? Garrison stopped at the top of the marble steps. He did not shrink away from the flashing bulbs. He did not hide his face or rush toward the waiting town car. He stood perfectly still, projecting the immovable monolithic authority of a seasoned naval commander. The sheer force of his presence caused the chaotic shouting to slowly die down until the crowd of reporters fell into a hushed, expectant silence. Garrison looked directly into the lens of the closest broadcast camera. His expression was completely void of sorrow or regret. Biology does not excuse attempted murder. Garrison stated, his voice a sharp, resonant blade that easily cut through the ambient noise of the city. A shared last name is not a license for betrayal. He made his choice, and today he received exactly what he earned. I have nothing further to add. He did not wait for follow-up questions. He descended the steps with steady, measured strides, bypassing the sea of reporters entirely. He slid into the back seat of the waiting town car, the heavy door thudding shut and instantly severing him from the media circus. Garrison directed the driver away from the glittering financial district. They drove far past the exclusive multi-million-dollar luxury marinas where the elite parked their pristine fiberglass status symbols. They drove toward the industrial edge of the coastline, toward a quiet, gritty, working-class dock that smelled of raw diesel fish scales and rusted iron. This was a place of actual labor, a place completely devoid of the artificial glamour that had poisoned his son's mind. The town car rolled to a stop on the cracked gravel. Garrison stepped out and walked down the weathered wooden pier. He was not here to purchase a sleek, aerodynamic yacht. He was entirely finished with the hollow, performative world of luxury vessels. He walked directly toward a sturdy, heavily engineered commercial fishing boat secured at the end of the line. The vessel was a beautiful piece of practical machinery. It featured a thick, reinforced steel hull painted a deep utilitarian blue. The deck was wide and scarred from years of actual maritime work. It was a boat specifically designed to withstand brutal ocean storms, crushing waves, and relentless mechanical pressure. It was exactly the kind of machine Garrison understood and respected. It was honest. The broker, a weathered man with deeply tanned skin, handed Garrison the heavy brass keys. Garrison did not simply accept the keys and walk away. He stripped off his expensive navy blue suit jacket, draped it carefully over the wooden railing, and rolled up his crisp white shirt sleeves. He climbed down into the engine room of the fishing boat. The air down there was hot, smelling sharply of grease-old salt and marine fuel. It was a familiar, deeply comforting environment that instantly transported him back to the early, honest days of his career. He spent the next 45 minutes meticulously checking the engine lines himself. He inspected the high-pressure fuel injectors, tested the rubber tension on the auxiliary belts, and ran his calloused hands over the primary cooling valves. He traced the exhaust manifolds, ensuring the structural integrity of the steel was completely uncompromised. He trusted absolutely nothing but his own practical expertise. He knew exactly what an engine hold could do to a man if the machinery failed, and he refused to leave his survival to chance. When he was completely satisfied that the internal machinery was flawless, Garrison climbed back up to the main deck. He wiped the dark engine grease from his hands with a clean rag. He walked into the compact utilitarian wheelhouse and slid the heavy key into the ignition. He turned the key. The massive diesel engine roared to life instantly, a deep, rhythmic, powerful vibration that resonated through the steel hull and directly into the soles of his shoes. It was the undeniable heartbeat of a survivor. Garrison stepped out, cast off the heavy mooring lines, and let them drop heavily onto the wooden dock. He took the polished steel wheel in his hands and pushed the throttle forward. The sturdy vessel pulled away from the slip, cutting smoothly through the dark, churning harbor water. Garrison steered the boat away from the coastline, leaving the towering glass skyscrapers of Miami shrinking into irrelevance in the distance. He aimed the bow directly toward the endless, shimmering horizon of the open ocean. The sea wind whipped across his face, cold and biting. The ocean had not killed him. The crushing heat of the engine hold had not broken his spirit. The dark water had simply washed away the parasites, the liars and the traitors who had infested his life. It had stripped away the suffocating weight of his past and left him with absolute, undeniable freedom. The new order was permanently set. Garrison Cole pushed the throttle to maximum, riding the crest of the waves into the vast open blue. The ultimate lesson of this story is that true wealth is not measured by material accumulation, but by the integrity of the people you choose to keep in your life. Unearned privilege often breeds a toxic sense of entitlement, transforming familial bonds into transactional liabilities. When respect is replaced by greed, the foundation of any relationship inevitably crumbles. Survival requires the courage to recognize parasites, even when they share your bloodline, and the absolute discipline to sever those ties completely. We must protect our peace at all costs. Subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts with us right now.